In the centuries before the Viking Age, the northern world was a landscape of slow transformation. Long before ships carried raiders and traders across the seas, communities across what is now Norway, Sweden, and Denmark were developing in relative isolation, shaped by the geography and climate of northern Europe. The Ice Age had retreated thousands of years earlier, leaving behind rugged coastlines, deep fjords, dense forests, and countless lakes. These features defined every aspect of life for the peoples who would later be known as the Norse. Archaeology reveals how they adapted with persistence and ingenuity to an environment that was both demanding and generous. The land was thinly populated, yet abundant in natural resources, fish, game, timber, and metals. Survival required a close understanding of the seasons and of the land's limitations. Communities lived in dispersed farmsteads, linked by kinship ties and shared customs rather than centralized power. Over generations, they built a resilient culture capable of enduring isolation while absorbing influences from afar. By the end of the Bronze Age, around 500 BCE, Scandinavia was already part of a wider web of exchange that reached far into continental Europe. Bronze itself was not native to the region. It had to be imported, suggesting trade routes that connected the north with the metal-producing centers of Central Europe and beyond. In return, the people of the north offered amber, the translucent fossil resin found in abundance along the Baltic coast. Amber was prized across Europe, used in jewelry and ritual objects, and it became one of the first major exports of the Scandinavian peoples. The so-called Amber Road linked the Baltic to the Mediterranean, carrying not only goods but ideas, technologies, and aesthetic influences. Artifacts from this era, such as elaborately decorated bronze razors and spiral ornaments, show motifs inspired by distant cultures, yet reinterpreted through a distinctly northern style. This mixture of outside influence and local innovation would remain a hallmark of Scandinavian development throughout the centuries. The transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, beginning around 500 BCE, marked a profound economic and social shift. Iron ore was widely available in Scandinavia, and the adoption of iron technology allowed communities to produce their own tools and weapons without relying on distant trade. This independence reshaped local economies. Iron tools improved agriculture by enabling the clearing of forests and the cultivation of heavier soils. The resulting increase in food production supported population growth and the emergence of regional hierarchies. At archaeological sites like Jutland and central Sweden, remains of longhouses indicate the beginnings of more complex settlement patterns. These were not cities, but they were stable centers of agricultural production and social organization. The use of iron also democratized warfare. While bronze weaponry had been a sign of elite status, iron weapons became more widely available, allowing local leaders to defend their territories and extend their influence. Small-scale conflicts between chieftains began to shape the political map of the region. During this early Iron Age, Scandinavian society remained tribal, organized around extended families and local leaders who combined religious, legal, and military roles. Authority was personal rather than institutional. Power rested on the ability to command loyalty through generosity, courage, and success in war. Wealth was measured in livestock, land, and followers. Archaeological evidence of large burial mounds, such as those found at Bor and Jelling, suggests a social hierarchy already in place centuries before the Viking Age. In these graves, archaeologists have uncovered weapons, jewelry, imported goods, and even boats, symbols of status and belief in an afterlife where the journey continued. These early monuments reveal the deep roots of the social values that would later define Viking culture: honor, kinship, and the pursuit of renown that outlasted death. The physical landscape played an equally decisive role in shaping early Norse life. The mountains of Norway, the forests of Sweden, and the fertile plains of Denmark produced different regional adaptations. In Norway, limited arable land encouraged fishing, hunting, and seasonal herding. Communities clustered around fjords, where the sea provided both food and a natural highway. In Sweden, inland lakes and forests supported agriculture, iron smelting, and trade in furs. Denmark, with its open terrain and access to continental Europe, became the natural bridge between the Scandinavian peninsula and the wider world. These environmental contrasts fostered regional diversity, yet they also created a shared maritime orientation. Travel by land was often slow and difficult, while the sea connected rather than divided. Even in this early period, Scandinavians built simple plank boats and dugouts for fishing and local transport. In this reliance on the sea lay the seeds of the later maritime expansion. Religion and ritual life bound these scattered communities together through shared cosmological ideas. The people of the North viewed the natural world as alive with unseen forces. Deities, spirits, and ancestors were believed to influence harvests, weather, and fate. Sacrificial offerings, animals, weapons, and sometimes human remains were deposited in bogs and lakes as gifts to the gods. Sites like Talland and Illerup Odal in Denmark have yielded remarkable evidence of these practices. Entire armies' worth of weapons were ritually broken and cast into the water, possibly as thanks for victory or as part of seasonal rites. Such finds demonstrate a worldview in which warfare, fertility, and the sacred were intertwined. This spiritual landscape gave coherence to communities that lacked centralized political structures. It also nurtured an enduring respect for fate and the supernatural, elements that would later permeate Viking myth and literature. Between the 1st and 5th century CE, the Scandinavian world continued to evolve in relative seclusion, though traces of contact with the Roman Empire appear in both artifacts and customs. Roman coins, glassware, and luxury goods found in burial sites indicate trade and gift exchange between the empire and northern chieftains. These items were symbols of prestige, valued not for their utility, but for the status they conferred. The Roman presence to the south also provided a distant model of centralized authority and professional warfare, ideas that slowly filtered into northern consciousness. Yet Scandinavia remained outside the imperial orbit. It was too distant, too fragmented, and too self-sufficient to be drawn into Roman political structures. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century brought new opportunities. As trade networks shifted and populations migrated across Europe, the northern regions began to assert their own distinct identities. The centuries that followed saw the emergence of recognizable Proto-Norse cultures. Linguistic evidence shows that the early Germanic dialects of the region gradually evolved into a shared Norse language. This linguistic unity helped consolidate cultural identity across wide distances. Art styles also became increasingly distinctive. The so-called migration period art, characterized by intricate interlaced patterns and animal motifs, adorned weapons, jewelry, and tools. These designs, often abstract and symmetrical, reflected both aesthetic sophistication and symbolic meaning. The human-animal hybrid figures suggest beliefs in transformation and the continuity between life and death. Artistic expression served as both ornament and communication, transmitting values and myths in the absence of written language. By the 6th century, large communal halls began to appear, serving as centers of feasting, governance, and alliance building. Excavations at sites like Apokra in southern Sweden and Lidra in Denmark reveal impressive timber structures that functioned as gathering places for local elites. These halls were symbols of authority, spaces where law was recited, disputes settled, and hospitality displayed. The economy that sustained them rested on agriculture, animal husbandry, and trade in surplus goods. Iron production remained a cornerstone of wealth. Smelting sites discovered in central Sweden indicate industrial-scale output by early medieval standards. The combination of agriculture and metallurgy provided stability and a measure of prosperity. This social and economic base would later support the long-distance ventures of the Viking Age. The importance of trade cannot be overstated. Even before the famous Viking voyages, the peoples of the North were part of a dynamic network of exchange spanning the Baltic and North Seas. From the Finnish forests came furs and hides. From the east, slaves and silver. From the south, textiles and glass. In return, Scandinavians exported amber, iron, and crafted goods. Trade created contact zones where ideas spread along with commodities. It encouraged seafaring innovation, as merchants sought safer and faster routes between distant markets. Small trading stations evolved along river mouths and coastal inlets, some of which, like Ribe in Denmark and Birka in Sweden, would later become major urban centers of the Viking world. These proto-towns began as seasonal markets, but gradually acquired permanent populations of craftsmen and traders. They represent the early stages of urbanization in Scandinavia, centuries before the rest of Northern Europe followed suit. The archaeological record from this period shows increasing social differentiation. Grave goods vary widely in quantity and quality, indicating stratified wealth. Weapons, imported ornaments, and elaborate brooches distinguish the graves of local leaders and their families. In contrast, simpler burials reflect common agricultural households. This inequality suggests that power was consolidating around hereditary lines. Chiefs competed for influence through warfare, marriage, and the hosting of lavish feasts that redistributed wealth and cemented loyalty. The gift economy, the practice of giving and receiving as a social obligation, reinforced personal bonds and political alliances. Prestige items such as swords, silver, and decorated drinking horns circulated as symbols of honor. The structure of Norse society thus rested not only on economic production, but also on the exchange of symbolic capital. Throughout these centuries, Scandinavia remained on the periphery of the Christian world. Yet contact with Christian merchants and missionaries slowly increased awareness of different cultural and religious systems. While conversion would not take root for several more centuries, the exposure to foreign faiths contributed to an expanding intellectual horizon. This early cosmopolitanism prepared the way for the openness and adaptability that later characterized Viking engagement with other civilizations. At the same time, local traditions persisted with remarkable continuity. The Norse pantheon, legal customs, and oral storytelling maintained cohesion across vast territories. The result was a society both conservative and flexible, deeply rooted in ancestral practice, yet capable of rapid adaptation when opportunity arose. By the 7th century, advances in shipbuilding began to alter the scale of interaction. The earliest clinker-built boats, vessels with overlapping planks riveted together, appeared in burial finds such as the Nidum ship from southern Denmark. This design provided greater strength and flexibility in rough seas, marking a crucial step toward the seafaring prowess of later centuries. These boats were initially used for transport along coasts and rivers, but they demonstrated the potential for long-distance voyages. Ship burials from this era suggest that the sea had already become a central element of identity and status. To be buried with a ship was to be marked as a person of rank, one whose life and legacy were bound to the water. Maritime skill became both practical necessity and cultural ideal. Climate fluctuations also played a role in shaping early Scandinavian society. Periods of relative warmth improved harvests and encouraged population growth, while colder intervals led to migration and conflict. Environmental adaptability became a key strength. Settlements shifted, new lands were cleared, and trade routes adjusted as conditions changed. This flexibility underpinned the later capacity of the Norse to explore, colonize, and endure in diverse environments, from the temperate plains of England to the icy coasts of Greenland. Archaeological pollen studies and isotope analysis of skeletal remains have helped reconstruct these patterns, illustrating how environmental and human factors interacted in complex ways. One of the most revealing insights into pre-Viking Scandinavia comes from the continuity of settlement patterns. Many later Viking towns and farms stand atop sites occupied for centuries. This continuity suggests a strong attachment to land and lineage. Farms were not merely economic units, but ancestral estates, linking generations through inheritance and memory. The social order revolved around these family holdings, maintained by systems of customary law that balanced individual rights with communal obligations. Disputes were settled through assemblies, precursors of the later Thing system, local gatherings that adjudicated conflicts and upheld legal norms. These assemblies reveal the deep roots of participatory governance in Northern culture, centuries before the emergence of formal monarchies. By the early 8th century, The elements that would define the Viking Age were already in place. Scandinavia possessed a network of regional powers, a growing population, advanced metalworking, and increasingly sophisticated seafaring technology. Its people had centuries of experience in trade, exploration, and adaptation to challenging environments. Social structures based on honor and reciprocity fostered cooperation as well as competition. Religious traditions provided moral coherence and a shared sense of destiny. The cultural synthesis of independence, resilience, and maritime orientation made expansion not only possible, but almost inevitable. When external conditions, political fragmentation in Europe, economic opportunity abroad, and internal pressures at home aligned, the stage was set for a transformation that would carry the Norse across the known world. The study of pre-Viking Scandinavia thus reveals not a sudden awakening of a dormant people, but a gradual accumulation of capacity. The long centuries of experimentation in farming, metallurgy, governance, and navigation prepared the North for its dramatic entrance into recorded history. The societies that emerged from these processes were complex, self-reliant, and outward-looking. They did not invent seafaring or trade in an instant. They perfected skills honed through generations of necessity. By the time the first raiding ships appeared on the horizons of Britain and Francia, the cultural and technological foundation for such ventures had long been established at home. The world that preceded the Viking Age was one of quiet formation. In the interplay between environment, economy, and belief, the northern peoples forged a distinct civilization on the edge of Europe. Its hallmarks were endurance, adaptability, and a deep respect for the rhythms of nature. This early history provides the essential context for understanding the later dynamism of the Viking Age. Without the centuries of local innovation and gradual social evolution, the extraordinary expansion of the Norse across continents would remain inexplicable. From the scattered farmsteads of Iron Age Scandinavia, a maritime culture was emerging, one that would soon carry its influence from the North Atlantic to the Mediterranean and beyond. Over the next centuries, these foundations would transform isolation into opportunity and tradition into exploration as the dawn of the Viking Age began to rise. The 8th century of the Common Era marked the end of one world and the tentative beginning of another. Across the cold seas of the north, in the lands that would later be known as Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, societies that had long existed on the periphery of European history began to stir. These communities were not newly formed. Their roots stretched back into the Bronze and Iron Ages. Yet something in the late 8th century changed the direction of their destiny. The people of the North, bound by kinship and governed by local chieftains, were ready to move outward. The stage was set for the phenomenon later known as the Viking Age. By the year 750, the Scandinavian world was already connected to the European mainland through trade and occasional conflict. Archaeological evidence from trading centers such as Ribe in Denmark and Birka in Sweden shows that Scandinavian merchants dealt in furs, amber, iron, and slaves, exchanging them for silver, glass, and fine cloth from the Frankish and Slavic territories. Excavations have uncovered weights, scales, and Arabic dirhams, pointing to an economy increasingly based on exchange rather than subsistence. The Norse were already mobile traders and expert shipbuilders. What separated the next century from the one before it was not a sudden cultural awakening, but a shift in scale, ambition, and purpose. The transformation was gradual yet decisive. Improvements in shipbuilding allowed longer, riskier voyages. The clinker-built hull, made of overlapping planks fastened with iron rivets, gave the longship both strength and flexibility. A shallow draft enabled it to navigate not only open seas, but also rivers and estuaries. This combination of engineering features made the Norse longship one of the most advanced seafaring technologies of its time. It allowed warriors, traders, and explorers to move swiftly between coasts, to appear unexpectedly, and to retreat just as fast. The longship was both a tool of exploration and a statement of identity, a vessel that symbolized mastery over the sea and mobility as power. These maritime capabilities coincided with internal pressures that encouraged expansion. Scandinavia's population was growing. In many regions, Arable land was limited, and inheritance customs tended to divide property among heirs, leading to competition for resources. Younger sons without inheritance sought their fortunes elsewhere, and local chieftains looked beyond their territories for wealth to sustain their status. Trade could satisfy some of these ambitions, but raiding offered faster rewards and greater prestige. It was in this context that the first Viking raids began. In the summer of 793, a small island off the northeastern coast of England became the site of an event that would echo across medieval Europe. Lindisfarne, home to a Christian monastery founded in the 7th century, was a center of learning and devotion. It held manuscripts, relics, and treasures that reflected the piety and wealth of early medieval Northumbria. The arrival of Norse raiders that year was sudden and devastating. Contemporary accounts describe how they fell upon the monastery, plundering its goods, killing or enslaving the monks, and desecrating the sacred site. To the Christian chroniclers who recorded the event, this was not merely an act of violence, but a sign of divine wrath. The Anglo-Saxon scholar Alcuin lamented that never before has such a terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. From a modern historical perspective, the Lindisfarne raid was not a unique act of barbarism, but the beginning of a predictable pattern. Monasteries were among the richest and least defended institutions in early medieval Europe. Their locations along coasts and rivers made them accessible to seaborne attackers. The Norse recognized opportunity more than ideology. They targeted wealth rather than faith, and their attacks reflected pragmatism rather than deliberate desecration. Yet, because of the cultural and religious divide between Christian Europe and pagan Scandinavia, these raids were perceived as an existential threat. Over the next decades, similar raids multiplied. Monasteries and coastal settlements across the British Isles and the Frankish coasts were attacked. The Isle of Iona was raided in 795 and again in 802 and 806. The monastery of Jarrow, once home to the Venerable Bede, was plundered in 794. These early assaults followed a pattern. Small fleets of perhaps 2 or 3 ships, crews numbering a few dozen men, striking quickly in the summer months and returning home with plunder before winter. Such operations required coordination, seafaring skill, and knowledge of foreign shores, evidence of increasing organization rather than random savagery. The expansion of Viking activity was not limited to raiding. Alongside the bands of warriors, traders continued to sail between Scandinavia and the wider world. In fact, many early raiders were likely merchants who found that the distinction between trade and piracy could be fluid. Archaeological evidence from emporia like Hedeby in southern Denmark shows that these ports were vibrant centers of commerce, attracting merchants from across Europe. Hedeby's position on the Schlei fjord allowed access between the North Sea and the Baltic via short overland portages. Goods from the Islamic world, Byzantium, and the Frankish Empire passed through its markets. It was both a commercial hub and a melting pot of cultures, where Norse artisans, Slavic traders, and Saxon merchants mingled. The combination of trade and raiding strengthened Scandinavian economies. Silver hoards found across Sweden and Denmark, often buried in remote locations, suggest that large quantities of wealth flowed into the region during the 9th century. Many hoards contain Arabic coins, the dirhams of the Abbasid Caliphate, indicating long-distance trade connections via the Volga and Dnieper rivers. The same people who raided monasteries in the west were establishing trading colonies in the east. This duality, warrior and merchant, became a defining feature of the Viking Age. The social implications of this wealth were significant. Successful raiders returned home with silver, slaves, and prestige, which they used to consolidate power. Chieftains could reward their followers, expand their retinues, and build alliances through gift exchange. The material and symbolic value of plunder reinforced social hierarchies. As a result, raiding was not just an act of subsistence or opportunism, it became a mechanism of political advancement. In this way, external aggression mirrored internal competition. The same drive that fueled rivalry among local leaders pushed them to seek fortune abroad. Religious and cultural identity also played a subtle role. While Norse society remained largely pagan during the early Viking Age, Contact with Christian Europe brought new ideas and materials. Crosses, reliquaries, and liturgical objects were taken as loot, but often repurposed as decorative items. Some scholars interpret this as cultural appropriation, others as evidence of curiosity rather than devotion. In either case, the Norse were not isolated barbarians. They were participants in a broader network of cultural exchange, even if their role was often adversarial. The Frankish world, under Charlemagne and his successors, became another frequent target. The empire's extensive river systems offered access to inland settlements. In 799, Vikings appeared at the mouth of the Seine, attacking northern Francia. By 810, fleets were reaching as far as the coast of Aquitaine. Charlemagne attempted to respond by strengthening coastal defenses and constructing a fleet, but the vastness of the empire made complete protection impossible. The Norse exploited local divisions and the slow mobilization of royal armies. The Frankish annals record repeated incursions, often with payments of tribute to secure temporary peace. This practice, known later as Danegeld, reflected both the pragmatic nature of the raiders and the vulnerability of their targets. As raids became more frequent, they also grew more organized. Some groups began to overwinter abroad rather than returning home after each expedition. This allowed them to launch campaigns earlier in the spring and maintain supply bases. The earliest recorded overwintering occurred in Ireland around 840, marking a shift from seasonal raiding to semi-permanent presence. The transformation from transient bands to sustained settlements would characterize the next phase of the Viking Age. The motivations behind these expansions were complex and cannot be reduced to a single cause. Economic need, political ambition, social competition, and technological innovation all played their part. Climatic factors may have also contributed. Some evidence suggests that a period of relatively mild temperatures during the late 8th and 9th centuries improved agricultural yields and population growth, allowing surplus manpower for expeditions. Conversely, limited farmland in mountainous Norway may have encouraged outward migration. The Norse were both pushed by circumstance and pulled by opportunity. It is important to note that the image of the Viking as a violent invader, while grounded in historical reality, represents only one aspect of this era. Many Scandinavians traveled peacefully as traders, craftsmen, or settlers. Others served as mercenaries in foreign courts. The same maritime technology that enabled raids also facilitated diplomacy and cultural transmission. The Norse were part of a dynamic world system in which the North Sea and the Baltic acted as highways rather than barriers. The boundaries between raiding, trading, and migration were porous, and individuals might engage in all three activities over their lifetimes. From the perspective of the societies they encountered, the appearance of the Vikings was both a threat and a catalyst. The need to defend against fast-moving sea raids led to innovations in military organization and fortification. In England, King Alfred the Great would later construct a network of fortified towns, or buzz, as part of a comprehensive defensive system. In Francia, rulers built bridges across rivers to block Viking ships and garrison them with troops. These responses, though reactive, contributed to the consolidation of medieval states. The Vikings, often seen as destroyers, inadvertently accelerated political centralization across Europe. Linguistic and cultural exchanges followed in the wake of violence. Norse words entered Old English, particularly in regions under Scandinavian influence. Place names ending in by or thorp mark areas of Norse settlement. The Norse legal term thing, meaning assembly, found its counterpart in English as husting, from husthing, or household council. Over time, these borrowings reflected a deeper process of integration. Even at this early stage, the Viking Age was not solely a story of invasion, but one of contact, adaptation, and transformation. By the middle of the 9th century, Viking activity stretched from the North Atlantic to the Mediterranean. Fleets sailed up the Loire, the Rhine, and the Garonne. They attacked cities such as Nantes and Paris, negotiated ransoms, and withdrew with wealth that enriched their homelands. At the same time, Scandinavian traders ventured eastward through the Baltic, establishing routes to Novgorod and Kiev. This dual expansion, westward through conquest, eastward through commerce, created a web of Norse influence spanning thousands of kilometers. The archaeological record corroborates this wide reach. Silver hoards in Gotland and Sweden contain coins from England, the Frankish Empire, and the Abbasid Caliphate. Artifacts such as balance scales and weight stones indicate the ubiquity of trade. Runestones erected in memory of those who died in the east or fell in the west testify to the vast mobility of the Viking world. The age of local chieftains had given rise to a transcontinental network of exploration and exchange. Yet, as their reach expanded, so did internal differentiation among the Scandinavian regions. Norwegians tended to look westward toward the British Isles and the North Atlantic. Swedes focused eastward toward the Baltic and the Rus, and Danes became dominant in the southern North Sea. These regional orientations reflected both geography and political development. Denmark, with its fertile lands and proximity to the continent, emerged as a center of power under leaders such as Horik and later Harald Bluetooth. Norway, fragmented by fjords and mountains, produced independent chieftains who often acted autonomously. Sweden maintained connections with the Baltic trade routes. This diversity ensured that the Viking phenomenon would never be monolithic, but rather a mosaic of related yet distinct trajectories. The period between 750 and 850 was thus an age of initiation, an era when Scandinavian societies first projected their influence beyond their native coasts. It was a time of experimentation, adaptation, and boldness. The Norse were testing the limits of their mobility, discovering the vulnerabilities of their neighbors, and learning the practicalities of long-distance raiding and trading. The patterns established in this century, seasonal expeditions, the integration of warfare and commerce, and the accumulation of wealth through both, would define the next 200 years of Northern history. As the 9th century progressed, the Viking presence abroad became increasingly permanent. Bases in Ireland and northern Britain evolved into towns. Raiding expeditions transformed into political entities, with leaders seeking tribute, land, and legitimacy. What began as opportunistic assaults grew into sustained campaigns of conquest and colonization. The era of sporadic raids was ending. The age of settlement was about to begin. The Norsemen, once transient visitors to foreign shores, were becoming builders of new societies, shaping the landscapes and identities of regions far from their Scandinavian homelands. By the middle of the 9th century, the Norse presence across Europe had become an enduring reality. What had begun as sporadic coastal raids had evolved into a sustained process of migration, colonization, and integration. The Viking Age entered its second major phase, the era of settlements. Across the British Isles, Ireland, northern France, and the North Atlantic, the descendants of the early raiders began to establish towns, claim farmland, and create new political systems. The transformation from transient marauders to rulers and settlers was not abrupt, but gradual, driven by the same forces that had once launched their ships: ambition, resource scarcity, and the pursuit of wealth and honor. The early 9th century had taught the Norse valuable lessons. Coastal fortifications, military responses, and the payment of tribute by rulers such as the Carolingians made hit-and-run raids less profitable. Yet the discovery that certain regions offered not only wealth, but also fertile land and strategic harbors shifted the focus from plunder to possession. For chieftains seeking power, holding territory abroad became as important as raiding it. Archaeological evidence from England, Ireland, and France shows that by the 850s, Scandinavian groups were establishing semi-permanent bases that would evolve into settlements. These bases, initially used for overwintering, provided shelter for ships and stores, and became centers of trade and governance. The British Isles were the primary theater of this transformation. England, divided into multiple Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, and East Anglia, was both wealthy and politically fragmented. The vulnerability of these kingdoms made them attractive targets. In 865, a large Scandinavian force arrived in England. Contemporary chroniclers called it the Great Heathen Army, though modern historians view it less as a single unified army than a coalition of various war bands led by prominent chieftains, including the legendary brothers Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, and Ubba. Their campaigns marked a turning point. Unlike earlier raiders who returned home each season, this army stayed. It wintered in East Anglia, seized horses, and launched campaigns deeper into England. Over the following decade, the Great Army overran much of the country. Northumbria fell in 867, its city of York, Jorvik to the Norse, becoming one of the most important Viking settlements in Britain. East Anglia followed, and parts of Mercia submitted. Only Wessex, under the leadership of Alfred the Great, managed to resist effectively. By the late 9th century, vast portions of eastern and northern England were under Scandinavian control. This area came to be known as the Danelaw, a term denoting both geography and legal culture. Within the Danelaw, Norse laws, customs, and social structures took root. Place names with Norse suffixes like by, farm, thorpe, village, and thwaite, clearing, spread across Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, and the Midlands, reflecting deep settlement rather than temporary occupation. Archaeological excavations in York reveal the scale of Norse integration. Streets such as Coppergate were lined with workshops producing combs, jewelry, and leather goods. Artifacts of both Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon origin indicate coexistence and exchange. The city became a hub for commerce, connecting English interior trade routes with the North Sea. Coins minted in York bear both Latin and Norse inscriptions, suggesting an emerging hybrid culture. The Norse language left enduring marks on English vocabulary, particularly in everyday words, sky, law, husband, and window among them. These linguistic traces speak to centuries of interaction rather than short-lived conquest. In Ireland, a similar transformation unfolded. The island, fragmented among competing kingships, was first raided in the late 8th century. By the mid-9th century, Norse fleets began overwintering there, constructing fortified camps known as long forts. These were not simple encampments. Many developed into permanent towns. Dublin, founded around 841, became the most significant of them. Excavations reveal a planned settlement with wharves, streets, and workshops. The Norse brought with them urban organization to a largely rural landscape. They engaged in trade with the Irish hinterland, exchanging slaves, textiles, and silver. Over time, Norse settlers intermarried with local populations, producing a mixed Norse-Gaelic culture. These communities, known as Hiberno-Norse, spoke both Old Norse and Gaelic, blending traditions in art, craftsmanship, and political life. Other Irish towns such as Waterford, Wexford, and Limerick began as Viking strongholds before evolving into centers of trade. Their strategic positions along rivers and coasts made them natural points for exchange between Ireland and the wider Viking world. By the late 9th century, Dublin was not merely a raiding base, but a regional power. Norse kings such as Amlab, Olaf, and Ivar, ruled as local monarchs, engaging in both warfare and alliance with Irish rulers. Their descendants would play significant roles in the politics of both Ireland and the British Isles for generations. In Scotland and the Isles, Norse influence was equally profound. The Orkney and Shetland Islands, as well as the Hebrides and Isle of Man, were colonized by settlers from Norway, likely beginning in the late 8th or early 9th century. The sagas, though written centuries later, recall how Norwegian chieftains fleeing the growing power of Harald Fairhair sought new lands across the sea. Archaeological evidence supports sustained settlement in these islands, where Norse farms, runic inscriptions, and burials have been uncovered. The Hebrides, with their sheltered inlets, served as vital waypoints for voyages between Norway, Ireland, and Britain. Norse settlers brought new agricultural techniques and integrated with local Pictish and Gaelic populations, leaving a cultural imprint visible in place names and genetic studies. Further south, Viking activity along the coasts of Francia took a different path. Repeated raids on the Seine, Loire, and other rivers forced the Carolingian rulers to negotiate. The most significant outcome of these interactions was the establishment of Normandy. In 911, the Frankish king Charles the Simple granted land in the lower Seine valley to the Viking leader Rollo in exchange for his oath of loyalty and promise to defend the region from further attacks. This pragmatic agreement laid the foundation for a new polity. Rollo and his followers adopted Christianity, intermarried with local Frankish families, and gradually assimilated into the feudal structure of Western Europe. Within 2 generations, their descendants were fully integrated as Norman nobles. Yet, they retained a legacy of maritime ambition that would culminate in the Norman conquest of England in 1066. Normandy illustrates how Viking settlements evolved from violent intrusion into legitimate political power. The process of settlement across these regions reveals much about Viking adaptability. The Norse did not impose a uniform model of rule. Rather, they adjusted to local conditions. In England, they became rulers within existing frameworks, adapting to the Anglo-Saxon system of governance and coinage. In Ireland, they introduced urban life to a society organized around rural kingships. In Francia, they transformed from raiders into feudal lords. Their ability to blend aggression with pragmatism allowed them to endure long after the era of raids had passed. This pattern of integration challenges the traditional image of the Viking Age as an era defined solely by violence. It was equally an age of synthesis and cultural negotiation. Trade flourished under these new settlements. The North Sea became a corridor connecting Dublin, York, Hedeby, and the markets of the Frankish coast. Ships carried wool, iron, amber, wine, and slaves. The latter trade, though often overlooked, was central to the Viking economy. Captives from raids or warfare were sold across Europe and even to the Islamic markets via the Rus routes. The prosperity generated by this trade funded further expansion and the construction of towns. At sites such as York and Dublin, workshops produced goods for both local use and export. Norse artisans specialized in metalwork, wood carving, and textiles. The standardized weights and measures found at these sites reflect a sophisticated commercial system grounded in trust and reputation. Socially, settlement required new forms of organization. Whereas early raiding bands were bound by personal loyalty to chieftains, settled communities needed laws, property systems, and mechanisms for dispute resolution. The Norse brought with them the institution of the Thing, an assembly of free men who deliberated on legal and political matters. In the Danelaw and the Isles, these assemblies continued to function, sometimes merging with local traditions of communal governance. Through the Thing, settlers maintained a sense of identity while adapting to their surroundings. The concept of law and assembly would remain a defining feature of Scandinavian-derived societies, later influencing the development of representative institutions in medieval Europe. Religion, too, began to shift during this era. While most settlers in the early phase remained adherents of the Old Norse gods, contact with Christian neighbors gradually introduced new beliefs. In places like Normandy, conversion was a political necessity. In England and Ireland, intermarriage and diplomacy encouraged gradual Christianization. Archaeological finds show graves containing both pagan symbols, such as Thor's hammer amulets, and Christian crosses, often within the same community. This coexistence suggests a transitional phase where old and new faiths intertwined. Conversion would become a central theme of the later Viking Age, but its roots lay in the encounters and compromises of these settled societies. The physical landscape of settlement also reveals transformation. In the Danelaw, rural patterns of habitation shifted as Norse agricultural techniques merged with Anglo-Saxon ones. Longhouses, characterized by their rectangular forms and timber frames, appeared alongside native styles. In Ireland and the Isles, ringforts were adapted into Norse-style enclosures. Evidence from Orkney and Shetland indicates that Norse farmers introduced new methods of livestock management suited to the harsher climates. These material changes, though subtle, marked the permanent integration of Norse influence into the geography of Northern Europe. By the early 10th century, the children of the original settlers no longer saw themselves as outsiders. In England, Norse and Anglo-Saxon communities coexisted under complex political arrangements. Some Viking leaders, such as Guthrum of East Anglia, converted to Christianity and ruled as kings under new names. The treaty between Alfred of Wessex and Guthrum established boundaries between English and Danish rule, but also recognized mutual coexistence. In Ireland, the Norse Gaelic dynasties of Dublin became integral to regional politics. In Francia, the descendants of Rollo administered their territories as loyal vassals of the French crown. The Viking Age was becoming less about raids and more about the formation of new identities. The shift from mobility to settlement did not end warfare, but it changed its character. Instead of seasonal raids, conflicts became territorial struggles. Control of trade routes, fertile valleys, and urban centers defined power. Warfare was increasingly tied to governance rather than plunder. This evolution marked the gradual transition from the heroic, kin-based culture of early Viking society to more structured forms of monarchy and statehood. Leaders who could unite territories, administer justice, and control resources gained legitimacy. The seeds of medieval Scandinavian kingdoms were being sown both at home and abroad. These developments also influenced Scandinavia itself. Wealth and ideas flowed back from the settlements into the homeland. Imported silver and luxury goods reinforced the power of emerging kings. The example of successful rulers abroad, from the Norse Gaelic kings of Dublin to the Norman lords of Rouen, demonstrated the advantages of centralized authority. In Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, local chieftains began to consolidate under stronger monarchs, setting the stage for the later unification of these kingdoms. Thus, the Viking settlements abroad were not isolated episodes, but catalysts for political evolution across the Nordic world. The archaeological record continues to shed light on this period of transformation. In York, waterlogged soils preserved wooden artifacts, shoes, combs, and tools that revealed details of daily life. In Dublin, excavations at Wood Quay unearthed layers of houses and workshops, each representing generations of continuous occupation. In the Hebrides, Norse longhouses stand beside earlier Celtic structures, symbolizing the blending of cultures. In Normandy, the continuity of landholding from Rollo's time into the feudal era demonstrates institutional stability. Together, these findings confirm that the Viking Age was as much about construction as destruction. By 950, the Scandinavian diaspora extended from the steppes of Eastern Europe to the coastlines of North America's threshold. The settlements in the British Isles and Francia had stabilized, while new voyages were opening routes to Iceland, Greenland, and beyond. The Norse had transformed from feared raiders into integral participants in the medieval world's economic and political systems. Their ships carried not only warriors but families, merchants, and monks. Their language mixed with others, their laws adapted to local conditions, and their gods shared space with new faiths. The world of the Viking Age had expanded far beyond the image of fire and sword that had once defined it. The century between 850 and 950 marked the heart of the Viking Age's transformation, an era when mobility matured into settlement and plunder gave way to permanence. Through adaptation and integration, the Norse shaped and were shaped by the lands they entered. Their towns became the seeds of modern cities. Their laws, the foundations of enduring governance. The age of raids had given birth to realms. In the next phase, these realms would face their own transformations as the Norse world turned inward to build kingdoms, embrace new religions, and define its enduring legacy within the fabric of medieval Europe. By the mid-10th century, the Viking world had entered a decisive stage of transformation. Across Europe, the generations who had once raided and settled were now rulers, merchants, and landowners. The Norse world, once characterized by mobility and maritime expansion, began turning inward, consolidating its power into structured kingdoms. The emerging monarchies of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden reflected both the wealth accumulated from centuries of exploration and the administrative influences absorbed from Christian Europe. It was during this period that the Old Norse world crossed its final threshold, from paganism to Christianity, from chieftainship to kingship, from scattered settlements to stable states. The transformation did not happen uniformly. Each Scandinavian region followed its own trajectory, shaped by geography, trade, and external pressures. Denmark was the first to unify, largely due to its strategic position between the Baltic and the North Sea. Archaeological and written sources describe Denmark's transition under powerful rulers like Gorm the Old and his son Harald Bluetooth. Around 950 CE, Harald Bluetooth consolidated Danish territories, strengthened royal authority, and initiated the Christianization of his realm. The famous Jelling stones, erected in central Jutland, stand as monumental records of this transformation. One stone commemorates Gorm's wife, Thyra, while another, raised by Harald, proclaims that he made the Danes Christian. These runic inscriptions, blending traditional motifs with Christian symbolism, mark a symbolic bridge between the Old World and the New. Harald's reign demonstrates how religion and kingship became intertwined. Conversion was not merely a matter of faith, but a political strategy. Christianity offered a unifying ideology and an administrative framework aligned with the rest of Europe. The establishment of bishoprics and churches tied Denmark to the continental ecclesiastical network. It also legitimized the monarchy in the eyes of Christian rulers to the south. Harold's acceptance of Christianity likely followed both external pressure from the Holy Roman Empire and internal motivations to strengthen royal authority. The construction of fortified ring forts, Trelleborg, Furkit, and Aggersborg among them, reflects a kingdom organized for defense and governance, not mere raiding. Their symmetrical designs, advanced logistics, and standardized layouts indicate centralized planning unprecedented in earlier Scandinavian society. While Denmark consolidated early, Norway's unification was slower and more contested. Its rugged terrain and dispersed population made centralized rule difficult. Yet over the 10th century, a series of ambitious leaders began to impose unity through conquest and alliance. The sagas attribute the initial unification to Harald Fairhair, but historical evidence suggests a gradual process continuing through the reigns of Håkon the Good and Olaf Tryggvason. Håkon, educated in England, introduced Christianity to parts of Norway but faced resistance from traditionalist chieftains. His reign demonstrates the delicate balance between innovation and tradition that characterized this era. The decisive transformation occurred under Olaf Haraldsson, known later as Saint Olaf. Ascending to power in the early 11th century, Olaf sought to consolidate royal authority and promote Christianity as a tool of unity. He founded churches, introduced new laws, and attempted to curb the power of local chieftains. His reforms met fierce opposition, and his eventual defeat and death at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030 turned him into a martyr. Within a year of his death, Olaf was canonized, and the cult of Saint Olaf spread rapidly across Scandinavia. His sanctification gave religious legitimacy to the Norwegian monarchy and symbolized the merging of faith and state. The shrine at Nidaros, modern Trondheim, became one of Northern Europe's most important pilgrimage centers, drawing travelers from across the Christian world. Sweden's path differed again. Its political landscape remained decentralized well into the 11th century, with powerful regional centers at Uppsala and Birka. Pagan traditions, particularly the worship of Odin and Freyr, persisted longer there than in Denmark or Norway. The temple complex at Gamla Uppsala, mentioned in medieval sources, suggests that religious and political power were closely linked. Kings were not only rulers, but also high priests responsible for maintaining the favor of the gods. Nevertheless, contact with Christian Europe through trade, missionaries, and diplomacy gradually eroded the old religion. Missionaries from the Archbishopric of Hamburg-Bremen, notably Ansgar and later Uni, made repeated efforts to establish churches in Sweden. By the early 11th century, Christian communities had formed in central and southern Sweden, and by the reign of King Olaf Skotkonung, who ruled around 995 to 1022, the kingdom officially adopted Christianity. Olaf Skotkonung's decision to mint coins bearing Christian symbols and Latin inscriptions was both an act of faith and a statement of sovereignty. It linked Sweden to the European monetary economy and demonstrated participation in a broader Christian political order. The gradual establishment of dioceses and the decline of public pagan ceremonies reflected this transition. By mid-century, Sweden, like its neighbors, was integrated into the continental Christian network. Yet even then, traces of the old beliefs endured in local customs and folklore, illustrating that cultural transformation often outlasted formal conversion. Religion was only one dimension of change. The 10th and 11th centuries also witnessed profound economic shifts. Trade routes that had once carried silver and slaves along the rivers of Eastern Europe began to decline as the Islamic Caliphate's demand for northern goods lessened. In their place, new western routes flourished. The ports of Hedeby, Ribe, and Burqa evolved into centers of exchange between Scandinavia and the Christian world. Craftsmen produced metalwork, jewelry, and textiles that circulated across northern Europe. The growth of towns like Roskilde and Lund in Denmark and Trondheim in Norway reflected a new urban culture grounded in commerce and administration rather than raiding. Archaeological finds of scales, weights, and imported pottery attest to a monetized economy increasingly integrated with continental markets. The changing economy supported the rise of a new social order. The old warrior aristocracy of the Viking Age gradually gave way to landholding nobles tied to royal courts. The practice of gift exchange, once the foundation of loyalty among chieftains, evolved into formalized systems of taxation and service. Kings demanded tribute not in plunder but in coin or produce, using it to fund infrastructure and military defense. The construction of churches and fortifications required organized labor and resources, fostering administrative institutions. The Scandinavian monarchies thus mirrored developments in the rest of medieval Europe, where centralized authority grew through a combination of religious sanction, economic control, and bureaucratic innovation. These changes had far-reaching consequences for identity and culture. The Norse language, once unified across the Viking world, began to diverge into regional dialects that would later form Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish. Runic writing persisted but was gradually replaced by the Latin alphabet as Christianity spread literacy. Art and ornamentation also evolved, blending traditional motifs with Christian iconography. The intricate animal interlaced designs of the Viking Age gave way to stylized crosses and inscriptions. Yet even as these symbols changed, they retained echoes of earlier aesthetics, preserving continuity amid transformation. The process of Christianization brought profound shifts in worldview. The old religion, rooted in cycles of nature and ancestral honor, gave way to a faith emphasizing salvation, sin, and divine hierarchy. Burial practices changed accordingly. Graves that once contained weapons, jewelry, and ships were replaced by simple Christian burials aligned toward the east. The famous ship burials at Oseberg and Gokstad, belonging to the earlier Viking Age, had no counterparts in this later period. Instead, stone churches and churchyards became the markers of faith and community. Monasteries were established, serving both religious and economic functions. They introduced literacy, record-keeping, and agricultural innovation. Through them, Scandinavia joined the intellectual and spiritual network of medieval Europe. Despite the spread of Christianity, traces of older beliefs persisted in daily life. The transition was gradual, not absolute. In rural areas, customs honoring ancestors and protective spirits continued under new Christian guises. Festivals aligned with agricultural cycles, such as Yule, were reinterpreted as Christian holidays but retained their seasonal significance. The blending of traditions created a uniquely Scandinavian Christianity that coexisted with deep cultural memory. This syncretism helped ensure that conversion, rather than destroying Norse identity, reshaped it into a new form compatible with European Christendom. The consolidation of kingdoms also altered Scandinavia's external relations. Where earlier generations had sought wealth through raids, the new monarchs pursued influence through diplomacy and dynastic marriage. Scandinavian rulers intermarried with European nobility, aligning themselves with the Christian political order. Harald Bluetooth's successors maintained close ties with the Holy Roman Empire, while Norwegian and Danish princes married into English and Slavic dynasties. These alliances extended the Norse presence into the sphere of European politics. The resulting cultural exchange accelerated the adoption of continental practices, legal codes, coinage systems, and ecclesiastical organization, while maintaining distinct Scandinavian adaptations. England remained a crucial arena for Scandinavian ambition. Even after the decline of the Danelaw, Norse influence persisted. The late 10th century saw renewed Danish invasions, culminating in the rise of King Sweyn Forkbeard, and his son, Knut the Great. In 1013, Sweyn successfully seized the English throne, marking the first time a Scandinavian ruler governed England. His rule was brief, but Knut's subsequent reign from 1016 to 1035 established a North Sea empire that united England, Denmark, and Norway under a single crown. Knut's empire represented the high point of Viking political power in Europe. His administration blended Anglo-Saxon institutions with Scandinavian authority, emphasizing law, order, and Christian kingship. Knut's reign illustrates how far the Viking world had evolved. A century earlier, Scandinavian leaders had been outsiders raiding Christian kingdoms. Now they ruled them. Contemporary chronicles describe Knut as a wise and devout ruler who patronized churches and maintained peace. His empire fostered cultural and economic integration across the North Sea. Though short-lived, it demonstrated the potential of the northern monarchies to operate within the broader framework of medieval Christendom. After Knut's death, the union quickly dissolved, but its legacy endured in the continued political and cultural ties between England and Scandinavia. The expansion of Scandinavian influence also reached eastward. Swedish rulers maintained connections with the Baltic and the lands of the Rus, where Norse merchants had established trading routes centuries earlier. The Varangian Guard, an elite unit of Norse warriors serving the Byzantine emperors in Constantinople, became a symbol of this enduring transcontinental network. Recruited from Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, these guardsmen brought back wealth and stories that linked the northern kingdoms to the heart of the medieval world. Their service in distant lands reflected the persistence of Viking mobility, even as the age of raids had long passed. By the middle of the 11th century, the transformation of Scandinavia was complete. The once fragmented chieftaincies had become Christian monarchies integrated into the political and religious systems of Europe. The last major pagan strongholds fell during this time. The temple at Uppsala was dismantled, and Christian bishops replaced traditional priests. Churches stood where wooden halls once hosted feasts dedicated to the gods. The Norse world had entered the Middle Ages. Yet the legacy of its earlier centuries endured, in maritime skill, legal traditions, and cultural resilience. The conclusion of the Viking Age cannot be marked by a single event, but historians often point to the mid-11th century as its symbolic end. The death of King Harald Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066 is often cited as the final chapter. Hardrada, a veteran of the Varangian Guard and a descendant of earlier Viking kings, sought to reclaim the English throne but was defeated by King Harold Godwin's son. Only weeks later, England itself would fall to the Normans, descendants of Viking settlers who had embraced Frankish language and culture. The two invasions of 1066, one led by a Norwegian and the other by a Norman, represented both the end and the culmination of the Viking story. The age that began with raids on England's shores ended with two rival heirs of the Norse world contending for its crown. In the centuries that followed, the Scandinavian kingdoms continued to evolve within the Christian European order. They developed parliaments, codified laws, and built cathedrals. The memory of the Viking Age persisted not as a living tradition, but as a foundation for national identity. Chronicles and sagas written in the 12th and 13th centuries preserve the stories of earlier generations, transforming history into legend. Yet behind the legends stood real societies that had undergone one of the most remarkable transitions in European history, from tribal raiders to Christian monarchs, from local chieftains to international rulers. This transformation reshaped not only Scandinavia, but the wider medieval world. The maritime networks forged by Viking explorers connected distant regions, facilitating the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies. Their settlements laid the foundations of cities such as Dublin, York, and Rouen. Their laws and governance structures influenced the political development of Northern Europe. The adoption of Christianity and the creation of centralized monarchies brought Scandinavia into the European mainstream without erasing its distinct heritage. The enduring balance between continuity and adaptation defined the Norse legacy. By 1050, the Viking Age had fulfilled its historical trajectory. What began as a movement of raiders and settlers had become a civilization of kingdoms and churches. The longships that once carried warriors to foreign shores now carried pilgrims and merchants. The runestones that once invoked gods now bore crosses. The Norse world had not vanished, it had transformed. The spirit of exploration, adaptability, and resilience that defined the Vikings endured in the societies that succeeded them, societies that would continue to shape the medieval North for centuries to come. The consolidation of kingdoms and conversion to Christianity marked the final transformation of the Viking world. It was the bridge between the age of the longship and the age of the cathedral, between the heroic past and the structured order of the Middle Ages. As the 11th century drew to a close, the once pagan North stood firmly within the orbit of Christian Europe, its ships still sailing, its language still echoing, and its influence woven into the enduring fabric of the continent's history. After the middle of the 11th century, the northern world entered a new era. The time of the Vikings had passed, yet its consequences continued to shape Europe in subtle and enduring ways. The men and women who once ventured across oceans to raid, trade, and settle had become ancestors of kingdoms that now stood firmly within the structure of Christian Europe. The Viking Age had ended, but its legacy remained visible in the languages, laws, and landscapes of the North, in the memories of those who traced their descent from the seafarers, and in the material traces unearthed by later generations. The transformation from Viking to medieval society did not occur overnight. In the decades following 1050, the Scandinavian kingdoms consolidated their political and ecclesiastical institutions. Kings ruled from permanent capitals, bishops administered dioceses, and monasteries preserved written culture. The warrior expeditions that had defined the previous centuries gave way to organized armies under royal command. Trade networks became regulated through ports and tolls, and the restless mobility of earlier generations was replaced by more stable social hierarchies. Yet within these settled structures, the memory of the Viking Age persisted as both history and identity. The same seas that had once carried raiders now supported commerce and pilgrimage. The skills developed in shipbuilding, navigation, and trade continued to define Scandinavia's role in the wider European economy. As Christianity spread fully through the north, literacy followed. Latin became the language of administration and scholarship, but local vernaculars soon developed written forms. It was within this context that the Norse sagas were composed. Written between the 12th and 13th centuries, these texts preserve the memory of the Viking Age in literary form. Works such as the Heimskringla, the Saga of the Icelanders, and the poetic Edda blended oral tradition with historical recollection. Although written centuries after the events they described, they offered insight into the worldview of earlier Scandinavians, their values of honor, kinship, and destiny. These sagas shaped modern understanding of the Viking Age as much as any archaeological discovery. The preservation of these narratives in Iceland was particularly significant. Isolated from the political consolidation of mainland Scandinavia, Iceland maintained a strong literary culture based on oral history and legal record-keeping. The Islandingabok and Landnámabók recorded the settlement of the island and its genealogy of families. The Eddas preserved pre-Christian mythology in poetic and prose form, ensuring that the beliefs of the old religion were remembered even as the society that practiced them had long converted to Christianity. Through these texts, the intellectual heritage of the Viking Age was transmitted to posterity, providing one of the richest bodies of medieval literature in Europe. Archaeology later confirmed and expanded the picture drawn by these sources. From the 19th century onward, excavations across Scandinavia and former Viking territories revealed ships, weapons, tools, and jewelry that spoke of a complex and far-reaching civilization. The discoveries at Oseberg and Gokstad in Norway uncovered ship burials of remarkable craftsmanship, showing not only maritime skill but also social hierarchy and ceremonial culture. In Denmark, the reconstruction of Harald Bluetooth's ring forts and the analysis of the gelling stones provided tangible evidence of the kingdom's early state formation and conversion. In Sweden, the Birka excavations uncovered a bustling trade town linking Scandinavia to the wider world through the Baltic and beyond. Each find transformed the understanding of a society once known mainly from foreign chronicles that depicted the Vikings as barbarians and raiders. Archaeology restored their sophistication and range. Beyond Scandinavia, the physical legacy of the Viking Age remained imprinted across the map of Europe. Place names in England, ending in by, Thorpe, or Thwaite, marked former Norse settlements. In Ireland, the cities of Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick trace their foundations to Norse colonists who evolved from raiders into merchants. Normandy in France, named for the Northmen, grew into a powerful duchy that would conquer England in 1066 under William the Conqueror. The same Norse seafaring tradition that had once attacked Christian monasteries now underpinned one of Europe's most enduring ruling dynasties. Even in the East, the memory of the Varangians, the Norsemen who established the early Russian principalities, persisted in chronicles and in the language of trade and governance. The spread of Norse influence also left linguistic and cultural traces that endured for centuries. In English, hundreds of everyday words have Scandinavian roots: sky, law, window, husband, and knife among them. These borrowings reflected not just conquest but coexistence, the blending of cultures within regions like the Danelaw. Legal traditions also bore marks of Norse influence. Concepts of personal freedom, assembly, and compensation through law, embodied in the Icelandic Althing and similar assemblies, resonated with later forms of representative governance in Northern Europe. The legal customs that emphasized negotiation and restitution rather than absolute authority contributed to the distinctive political evolution of Scandinavia in the medieval period. As centuries passed, the memory of the Viking Age was reinterpreted to suit new needs. In medieval Scandinavia, the old heroes were recalled in sagas that celebrated lineage and valor. In the Renaissance and Enlightenment, antiquarians and historians began to study runestones and chronicles, treating the Viking past as a source of national pride. During the 19th century, as European nationalism grew, the image of the Viking was reshaped once more, now as a symbol of independence, courage, and maritime heritage. Artists and poets romanticized the seafarers as noble explorers rather than plunderers. This reinterpretation paralleled similar movements across Europe, where nations sought ancient origins to legitimize their modern identity. The rediscovery of the Viking past also coincided with the rise of modern archaeology. In Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, systematic excavations transformed myth into evidence. Scholars developed typologies for weapons, tools, and ships, establishing a reliable chronology of the Viking Age. Museums displayed the reconstructed longships, allowing visitors to see the engineering precision that had enabled transoceanic voyages centuries earlier. These discoveries shifted popular understanding from legend to material culture, grounding the Viking story in verifiable history. In the 20th century, further discoveries deepened that understanding. The excavation of trading centers like Hedeby and Koppang revealed networks of commerce connecting the North Sea, Baltic, and Eurasian heartlands. Burial sites in Britain and Russia demonstrated the extent of migration and integration. Analysis of DNA and isotopic evidence in recent decades confirmed the diversity of Viking society, men and women from across Scandinavia, but also from Celtic, Slavic, and even Middle Eastern origins who joined or intermarried within Norse communities. The Viking Age was revealed not as an ethnically uniform movement, but as a dynamic, interconnected system of exchange and adaptation. Modern scholarship continues to refine this picture. Far from the stereotype of relentless raiders, the Vikings are now understood as participants in the broader transformation of early medieval Europe. Their maritime networks linked distant regions, facilitating the spread of goods, technologies, and ideas. Their settlements introduced urbanization and economic specialization to previously rural regions. Their encounters with Christianity and continental powers accelerated state formation in the north. The violence that accompanied their expansion cannot be denied, but it was accompanied by innovation and integration. The Viking Age was not an anomaly, but a critical phase in Europe's transition from the ancient to the medieval world. The enduring fascination with the Vikings lies partly in this complexity. They represent both destruction and creation, both tradition and transformation. Modern audiences see in them a mirror of human adaptability, the ability to thrive in harsh environments, to explore the unknown, and to assimilate without losing identity. The archaeological record shows communities that balanced local custom with global connection, a balance that resonates with contemporary societies facing similar questions of identity and change. The physical legacy of the Vikings endures not only in artifacts, but in the landscapes of northern Europe. The burial mounds at Uppsala, the ship's settings at Anundshag, and the runestones scattered across Scandinavia remain silent witnesses to their history. These monuments, once intended to commemorate individuals, now connect modern visitors with an entire civilization. Each rune, carved in stone over 1,000 years ago, represents an attempt to be remembered, to assert continuity between generations. In that sense, they achieve their purpose. Through archaeology, literature, and collective memory, the Vikings continue to be remembered across continents. The maritime heritage of the Viking Age also survives in the cultural traditions of the North. Norway's coastal communities preserve boat-building techniques rooted in the same principles as the longship. Festivals and reenactments celebrate the craftsmanship and seamanship that define the age. In these practices, the line between history and heritage blurs. The Viking story becomes not only a subject of study, but a living element of identity. For scholars, it remains a field of inquiry. For communities, it remains a legacy of resilience and exploration. In recent decades, advances in scientific analysis have opened new dimensions of research. Underwater archaeology has located shipwrecks that reveal construction methods and trade routes. Isotopic studies of skeletal remains illuminate patterns of diet and migration. DNA sequencing has traced familial links across Viking settlements, confirming what sagas once implied, that the Viking world was not isolated tribes, but a transnational network of kinship and exchange. These discoveries reinforce the view that the Viking Age was an early form of globalization, connecting Scandinavia to regions as distant as Byzantium and North America. The westernmost extension of that world, the Norse colonies in Greenland and the brief settlement at Vinland, in present-day Newfoundland, represents the final frontier of Viking expansion. Though short-lived, these ventures demonstrate the reach of their seafaring technology and ambition. The archaeological site at Lance aux Meadows, confirmed in the 20th century as Norse, provides material proof that Europeans crossed the Atlantic centuries before Columbus. These settlements did not endure, likely due to climate change and isolation, but they marked the culmination of an era defined by exploration. After them, the Norse turned increasingly toward internal development and integration within Europe. By the close of the Middle Ages, the memory of the Viking Age had faded from daily life, but remained preserved in local traditions and chronicles. In Scandinavia's emerging universities and monasteries, scholars began to compile national histories that traced royal lineages to legendary ancestors. These efforts reflected both pride and continuity, the acknowledgement that the modern kingdoms of the North were heirs to a dynamic, formative past. As centuries passed, that memory transformed again, from living history to cultural mythology, then to scientific study. Today, the legacy of the Vikings extends beyond Scandinavia. Museums across the world display their artifacts, universities teach their languages, and popular media continues to reinterpret their image. While dramatized portrayals often emphasize violence or adventure, historical research restores balance, emphasizing craftsmanship, trade, and adaptability. This intersection between scholarship and imagination keeps the subject alive, ensuring that the Viking Age remains one of the most studied and recognizable periods in world history. Ultimately, the significance of the Viking legacy lies in its continuity. The same qualities that define the Viking Age, mobility, innovation, and resilience, became enduring features of Scandinavian culture. The maritime orientation of the region persisted into later centuries, supporting exploration, trade, and communication. The legal traditions of local assemblies evolved into parliamentary institutions that would characterize Nordic governance. Even the linguistic and artistic heritage of the Norse world survived in new forms, linking medieval Scandinavia to its modern descendants. When historians speak of the end of the Viking Age, they refer not to disappearance, but to transformation. The people of the North did not vanish. They adapted to new faiths, economies, and political systems while retaining the skills and outlook that had shaped their earlier centuries. The longship was replaced by the merchant vessel, the rune by the manuscript, the chieftain by the king. The spirit of exploration that once sent fleets to distant shores continued in quieter forms, in trade, learning, and diplomacy. Through archaeology and written record, the story of the Viking Age reveals the deep connections that bound early medieval Europe together. It demonstrates how a society at the edge of the known world could influence continents through mobility and innovation. And it reminds us that civilization often advances not through conquest alone, but through adaptation, the ability to absorb and reshape new ideas while preserving identity. The Vikings embodied this balance. Their age ended, but their influence did not. Through the artifacts they left, the languages they shaped, and the institutions they inspired, their story continues to teach how the North found its place within the wider human past, and how history itself preserves those who once sought only to be remembered. Life in the Viking world was grounded in rhythms both harsh and enduring, shaped by northern climates, rugged geography, and a culture that prized resilience. Long before they became seafarers, the Norse people lived as farmers, herders, and craftsmen. Their world revolved around the cycles of the seasons, when the lengthening days of summer brought opportunity for planting, travel, and trade, while the darkness of winter imposed reflection, storytelling, and domestic labor. The Viking Age did not erase these older patterns. It adapted them into a wider world of mobility and commerce. Archaeological excavations of farmsteads across Norway, Sweden, and Denmark reveal longhouses that served as both family dwellings and centers of work. Built from timber and turf, their single rooms combined sleeping areas, hearths, and workspaces, symbolizing the unity of household and livelihood that defined Norse society. At the heart of this society stood the concept of the bylai, the self-sufficient farmstead. Each was part of a local community, or BYGD, linked by kinship and shared responsibility. Farmers owned or rented strips of land divided by stone walls, with pastures for cattle, sheep, and goats, and fields of barley, rye, and oats. In coastal regions, fishing supplemented the diet, providing dried or salted fish that could last through the winter. The Norse were not primitive subsistence farmers, but sophisticated managers of limited resources. Finds of iron tools, grain storage pits, and irrigation traces demonstrate an agricultural competence suited to their northern environment. The continuity of this agrarian foundation was critical, for every voyage, raid, and trade expedition depended on stable home production. It is estimated that more than 90% of the Viking population remained bound to the land, making the image of the Viking as a full-time warrior a historical exception rather than a rule. Beneath the outward simplicity of rural life lay a complex social hierarchy. At its top stood the jarls, regional nobles who held extensive estates and commanded loyalty through gift-giving, feasting, and military leadership. Below them were the carls, free farmers and craftsmen who formed the backbone of Norse society. They owned property, bore arms, and could attend assemblies known as things, where disputes were settled and laws were debated. At the lowest rung were the thralls, enslaved individuals captured in warfare or born into servitude. They performed the labor that sustained larger households, working fields, tending livestock, and serving in domestic roles. Unlike the chattel slavery of later centuries, Norse slavery was integrated into household economies and could be temporary. Manumission was possible, though not common. Still, the presence of slavery reveals a society built on stratified dependence, not egalitarian myth. The thing, the assembly of free men, served as the foundation of governance. These gatherings were both judicial and legislative, ensuring local order in a decentralized world without formal states. Evidence from law codes, such as those later compiled in Iceland and Norway, reveals a sophisticated sense of legal custom, emphasizing restitution over punishment. Feuds were regulated through compensation payments, known as wergild, which valued human life and silver. The assemblies also elected leaders and managed alliances, maintaining a form of proto-democratic accountability rare in early medieval Europe. It is within these gatherings that Norse oral traditions found formal expression. Law speakers memorized and recited the legal corpus, transmitting it through generations before it was ever written down. The durability of these assemblies ensured continuity even as Norse territories expanded abroad. Within the Longhouse, social order was sustained by the family unit, or ett. Kinship determined inheritance, alliances, and the settlement of disputes. The authority of the household head, often male but sometimes female, was nearly absolute within its domain. Archaeological finds of keys buried with women suggest the symbolic and practical importance of female authority over domestic resources. In sagas and later chronicles, women appear not as silent figures, but as active agents in family affairs, trade, and even politics. Some managed estates while husbands were away. Others participated in commerce or accompanied expeditions. Female burials rich in jewelry, brooches, and imported goods indicate a status that, while distinct from male roles, commanded respect. The relative autonomy of Norse women compared to many contemporaneous societies was a feature that impressed early Christian observers. Religion in the Viking Age was not organized around sacred texts or a clerical hierarchy. Instead, it was embedded in daily practice, an animistic worldview where gods, ancestors, and natural forces coexisted with human endeavor. The pantheon of Odin, Thor, Freya, and others represented not distant deities but cosmic reflections of human experiences, wisdom, strength, fertility, and fate. Rituals were performed at Hof, wooden temples, or at home altars, where offerings of food, animals, or valuables sought favor or protection. The archaeological site at Apokra in southern Sweden, with its sequence of temple buildings, demonstrates the continuity of ritual space over centuries. Religion reinforced social bonds through seasonal festivals like Blot, where communal feasting linked the living with the divine. Unlike later Christian institutions, Norse worship lacked centralized doctrine. Belief was an evolving negotiation between people and their environment. The material culture of the Vikings reflected both practicality and artistry. Everyday tools were carefully crafted, often decorated with motifs that carried symbolic meaning. Iron was the lifeblood of Norse technology, used for plows, nails, weapons, and fittings. The mastery of iron smelting and bloomery furnaces enabled a steady production that sustained both agriculture and warfare. Craftsmanship extended into woodworking, weaving, and shipbuilding, each essential to survival and expansion. The intricate interlaced patterns found on wood carvings, jewelry, and runestones expressed a worldview of interconnectedness and order amid chaos. Such designs, later known as the Viking art styles, Osberg, Bohr, Jelling, Mammon, Ringerike, and Uns, trace an evolution of aesthetic refinement spanning the centuries of the Viking Age. These motifs were not mere ornamentation. They visualized continuity between mythic and mortal worlds. Trade formed another pillar of Norse life. Archaeological evidence from trading centers such as Ribe, Hedeby, and Birka reveals bustling markets long before the famous overseas raids. Artifacts of silver dirhams from the Islamic caliphates, beads from India, and glassware from the Frankish realms testify to vast commercial networks. The Vikings acted not only as raiders, but as intermediaries in Eurasian trade. Their ships, both merchant nar and warlike longship, symbolized this dual identity. Through river routes across Russia, Norse traders, known as Varangians, connected the Baltic to Byzantium, bringing furs, slaves, and amber in exchange for silk, wine, and silver. The integration of Scandinavian economies into broader trade systems helped transform regional chieftains into powerful rulers with international connections. This commercial expansion laid the foundation for later urbanization in the north. Daily life in the Viking world was marked by adaptation to environment. Clothing made from wool, linen, and animal skins protected against cold, while dyes and adornments expressed social rank. Food preparation centered on cereals, dairy, meat, and fish, with archaeological traces of bread ovens, cooking pots, and drinking horns found in domestic contexts. Brewing ale was common, serving both social and ritual purposes. Storytelling filled the long winter nights. Through oral poetry and sagas, memory was preserved. The skalds, poets attached to chieftain courts, played a vital role in recording deeds and lineages, ensuring that reputation, dringskap, remained a social currency. These narratives, later written down centuries after the Viking Age, nonetheless reflect the deep continuity of oral tradition in transmitting cultural values. Education in Viking society was informal but pervasive. Children learned through participation, boys in farming, herding, and craftwork, girls in weaving, food preparation, and household management. Skills were transmitted through imitation rather than instruction, embedding practical knowledge in every generation. Runes, carved on stone or wood, represented not only communication but also an element of sacred knowledge. The runic alphabet, Futhark, evolved over time from 24 to 16 characters, simplifying for everyday use. Runestones commemorated ancestors, marked boundaries, or celebrated deeds, making the landscape itself a record of collective memory. The combination of literacy, oral culture, and visual symbolism created a society capable of preserving complex information without centralized institutions. Health and medicine in the Viking world blended empirical observation with spiritual belief. Skeletal remains indicate an understanding of basic surgery, dental care, and herbal remedies. Textual references from later medieval sources suggest that Norse healers used local plants such as yarrow, angelica, and juniper. Illness was often interpreted as a disturbance of fate or the will of the gods, yet practical treatments reveal a pragmatic approach. Burial sites with evidence of healed fractures suggest that community care extended beyond superstition. The overall life expectancy was low by modern standards, but not unusually so for the early medieval period, perhaps 30 to 40 years on average, with survival depending heavily on nutrition and social standing. As the Viking world expanded, its social and cultural patterns evolved without losing their core identity. Contact with Christian Europe and the Islamic world introduced new materials, ideas, and technologies. Foreign coins altered local economies, imported textiles changed fashion, and exposure to other belief systems prepared the ground for eventual conversion. Yet the persistence of longhouses, kinship-based law, and the centrality of the thing demonstrate the resilience of Norse traditions. By the time Christianity spread through Scandinavia in the 10th and 11th centuries, the old religion had already intertwined with social customs to such a degree that transformation was gradual rather than abrupt. Pagan rituals became folk practices, ancestral feasts merged with church festivals. Continuity, not rupture, defined the transition. Understanding daily life in the Viking Age allows modern observers to see beyond the image of seaborne raiders. It reveals a civilization grounded in pragmatic balance between independence and community, tradition and adaptation, isolation and exchange. Archaeology, textual reconstruction, and environmental studies now allow historians to reconstruct this equilibrium with increasing precision. The Viking world was not a monolith, but a constellation of local societies linked by shared language, beliefs, and networks of exchange. Their ability to sustain this coherence across distances was perhaps their greatest achievement. It ensured that when external pressures eventually reshaped their world, the memory of their structure and culture endured in the emerging medieval kingdoms of the North. Over the next chapters, the story of the Viking Age turns from daily life to the institutions that governed collective destiny, the evolution of kingship, law, and faith that would redefine Scandinavia's place in Europe. The cultural foundations established in these centuries of domestic and communal order provided the framework upon which new forms of authority and identity would rise, bridging the pagan past with the Christian Middle Ages to come. In the centuries following the height of Viking expansion, the northern world entered a slow but decisive transformation. What had once been a patchwork of independent chieftaincies began to consolidate under emerging royal authorities. The seeds of kingship had existed for centuries in Scandinavia, rooted in local leadership and kinship prestige, but the experience of contact with Europe, commerce, and warfare catalyzed their maturation into enduring institutions. The process was neither uniform nor inevitable. It unfolded unevenly across Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, driven by geography, ambition, and necessity. Yet by the 11th century, these lands had begun to form recognizable states, united by law, faith, and the memory of a shared Norse heritage. In the early phases of this transformation, leadership was personal rather than bureaucratic. A chieftain's power depended on his ability to distribute wealth, maintain loyalty, and succeed in war. Silver from raids, tribute, and trade became the means by which authority was sustained. Archaeological finds of hoards across Scandinavia, often containing hundreds of Islamic dirhams, attest to the economic underpinnings of this emergent power. Such wealth circulated through networks of obligation known as gift economies. A leader's generosity confirmed his legitimacy. Feasting halls, like the great wooden structures excavated at Borg in Lofoten or Lidra in Zealand, were not merely residences, but political theaters where allegiance was affirmed and law was spoken. Within their fire-lit interiors, the foundations of royal authority were laid long before crowns or thrones existed. Denmark emerged first as a coherent political entity. Its geography, flat, fertile, and strategically positioned between the Baltic and North Sea, favored centralization. Control over trade routes and toll stations brought wealth, while proximity to the Carolingian Empire exposed Danish rulers to models of kingship rooted in Christian Europe. The earliest known Danish king, Godfred, mentioned by Frankish annals around 804 CE, built fortifications and imposed tolls on merchants sailing through Danish waters. His successors expanded these efforts, constructing ring forts such as Trelleborg and Furket, geometrically precise military complexes that reveal a striking degree of administrative planning. These strongholds symbolize the transition from tribal power to statecraft. The coordination required to build them, standardized designs, mass labor, and resource management, implies an organized authority that could command and sustain such undertakings. In Norway, geography posed both challenges and opportunities. Its coastline, carved by fjords and mountains, favored regional independence. Local chieftains maintained power through maritime control rather than centralized landholding. Yet these same fjords also connected distant communities, allowing ambitious leaders to unite territories through naval dominance. According to later sources such as the Heimskringla, the unification of Norway under Harald Fairhair around the late 9th century marked a symbolic turning point. While the sagas blend legend with history, archaeological and place name evidence suggest a genuine consolidation of power in southwestern Norway, likely centered around trade routes and taxation of seaborne commerce. Harald's reputed victory at Hafrsfjord represents, at minimum, the memory of unification achieved through naval supremacy. From this foundation emerged a royal lineage that would guide Norway into the Christian Middle Ages. Sweden's unification followed a slower trajectory. Inland geography and dispersed settlement patterns delayed political consolidation. Early centers of power, such as Gamla Uppsala, combined religious significance with royal authority. Excavations reveal monumental burial mounds and ceremonial halls, suggesting that the Swedish kingship evolved in tandem with cultic leadership. By the 10th century, rulers like Olaf Skotkonung adopted Christianity and minted coins, signaling both international recognition and internal stability. The persistence of regional identities within Sweden, Svea, Gotha, and others, meant that the emerging monarchy relied more on negotiation and alliance than outright conquest. Law and assembly traditions continued to hold strong, ensuring that royal power was tempered by communal consensus. Law remained the thread binding all Scandinavian societies through this transformation. Long before formal kingship, the Thing assembly had governed local justice. As kingdoms emerged, these local assemblies were integrated into broader legal hierarchies. Kings appointed lawmen to codify and interpret statutes, preserving continuity while introducing royal oversight. The earliest recorded laws, such as the Gulathing and Frostathing codes of Norway, balance ancient custom with the influence of Christian ethics. They regulate property, inheritance, and homicide compensation, but also prohibit pagan sacrifice and enforce church tithes. This synthesis of old and new illustrates how Norse societies adapted to the moral and institutional frameworks of medieval Christendom without abandoning their communal roots. Law became both a symbol and a tool of unification, a means to transform personal loyalty into civic order. The Christianization of Scandinavia was inseparable from the rise of kingship. Missionaries from the British Isles and the continent found their efforts strengthened when aligned with royal ambition. Conversion offered rulers access to literacy, diplomacy, and legitimacy in the wider European world. Kings such as Harald Bluetooth of Denmark proclaimed their Christianity on monumental stones, like the Jelling Stone, which declares that Harald made the Danes Christian. These inscriptions, carved in runic and Latin scripts, signify not merely religious change, but a deliberate political statement. Christianity provided a framework for divine kingship, law, and diplomacy. Through baptism and alliance, the northern rulers entered the network of European Christendom, transforming from seafaring warriors into recognized sovereigns. Despite these changes, the continuity of older values persisted beneath new institutions. Feasting, gift-giving, and martial honor remained vital components of political culture. Royal retinues, known as here, maintained the warrior ethos of earlier times, now in service of centralized authority. The imagery of Norse mythology gradually merged with Christian symbolism in art and literature, producing a hybrid aesthetic visible in stone crosses and wood carvings that combine interlaced dragons with cruciform designs. This fusion speaks to a gradual process of acculturation rather than suppression. The Norse world adapted external influences to its own sensibilities, ensuring that kingship remained grounded in local legitimacy rather than imposed orthodoxy. Urbanization accelerated under royal patronage. Towns such as Ribe, Hedeby, and Birka, once seasonal markets, developed into permanent settlements with streets, workshops, and churches. They became administrative and economic hubs, linking hinterlands to continental trade. The introduction of coinage facilitated taxation and commerce, further binding local economies to royal oversight. Archaeological evidence from these sites reveals the blending of cultures: Frankish pottery beside Scandinavian brooches, Arabic coins with runic inscriptions, illustrating the cosmopolitan nature of the emerging northern kingdoms. The construction of early cathedrals and episcopal centers marked the institutional consolidation of Christianity, while monasteries began to appear, introducing written record-keeping and education. The development of written language transformed governance. Latin became the medium of official communication, but runes persisted for vernacular use. The coexistence of these systems reflects the gradual literacy shift that accompanied state formation. Kings issued charters, treaties, and law codes, embedding their authority in text. This administrative literacy fostered continuity across reigns and facilitated interaction with the church and neighboring powers. By the late 11th century, Scandinavia possessed the infrastructure of medieval monarchy: royal courts, clerical bureaucracy, and codified law, integrated within the wider European order yet retaining distinctive northern features. The military remained central to royal legitimacy. Naval levies, known as leyanger, organized free men into regional fleets for defense and expansion. This system institutionalized the maritime expertise that had defined the Viking Age, transforming it from raiding to royal service. The construction of fortresses and the maintenance of coastal watch systems demonstrate the enduring strategic awareness of these societies. Yet the emphasis gradually shifted from conquest to protection. The very skills that once enabled Viking expansion were now repurposed to secure stable realms. The ethos of the warrior endured, but it was reframed within the responsibilities of kingship and law. The transition from chieftaincy to monarchy did not erase social diversity. Local aristocracies retained influence, often serving as intermediaries between crown and community. The persistence of regional assemblies ensured that governance remained consultative, if not democratic. This layered political culture, king, aristocracy, and assembly, prevented the emergence of absolute rule and preserved the participatory traditions of the early Norse world. The resulting balance produced resilience. Scandinavian monarchies proved remarkably durable compared to many contemporaneous European states. Their stability rested on compromise, continuity, and a shared cultural memory of communal governance. By the close of the 11th century, the Viking Age had given way to the Scandinavian Middle Ages. Kingship had become institutionalized, Christianity firmly established, and law written down. Yet the transformation was less a rupture than an evolution. The values that had guided earlier centuries, independence, honor, adaptability, remained embedded within the new order. The Norse legacy survived not only in sagas and monuments, but in the political and cultural structures that shaped Northern Europe for centuries to come. The consolidation of the Scandinavian kingdoms stands as one of the most significant outcomes of the Viking Age. The transition from mobility to rootedness, from fluid tribal loyalties to enduring national identities. The emergence of kingship marked the culmination of a long social process that began in the halls of local chieftains and ended in the courts of Christian monarchs. It bound together the strands of trade, warfare, faith, and law into a cohesive framework that could sustain complex societies. In the next stage of this narrative, attention turns from political structure to intellectual and artistic expression, the way in which the newly unified kingdoms preserved memory, myth, and identity through literature, art, and history, ensuring that the spirit of the Viking world would continue to resonate far beyond its temporal boundaries. In the Norse world, belief was not confined to temples or texts, but woven into the very rhythm of existence. Every fjord, field, and storm carried the presence of unseen forces. The Norse cosmos was vast and layered, structured around Yggdrasil, the great world tree whose roots and branches connected realms of gods, humans, and spirits. Unlike later monotheistic systems, Norse religion was decentralized and experiential. It emerged not from doctrine, but from tradition, oral transmission, and a worldview grounded in the cycles of nature and fate. The Vikings lived in a spiritual landscape where gods were neither distant nor infallible. Odin, the All-Father, embodied wisdom, sacrifice, and the restless pursuit of knowledge. His single eye, traded for cosmic insight, symbolized the value placed upon understanding even at great cost. Thor, the defender of gods and men, represented strength and stability amid chaos, wielding Mjolnir not just as a weapon, but as a tool of protection and sanctification. Freyr and Freya embodied fertility, prosperity, and the balance between life and death. Loki, the trickster, introduced tension and unpredictability into the divine order, ensuring that even among gods, conflict and change were inescapable. These deities reflected human conditions rather than transcending them. The Norse pantheon was not moralistic, it was pragmatic. Gods could deceive, fail, or die, and their struggles mirrored those of the people who worshipped them. This made the divine relatable. Life in the Viking world was uncertain, dependent on weather, harvest, and warfare, and their religion mirrored that instability. To the Norse, fate was not something to be overcome, but to be met with courage. This fatalism, encapsulated in the concept of Wyrd, shaped their ethics and their art. A good life was one lived with honor, not necessarily one rewarded by the gods. The cosmology that framed these beliefs divided existence into 9 realms, all connected by Yggdrasil's branches and roots. Asgard, home of the Aesir gods, stood in contrast to Midgard, the world of humans, linked by Bifrost, the shimmering bridge. Beneath them lay Hel, a cold and misty realm for those who did not die in battle. The giants inhabited Jotunheim, embodying elemental forces of nature, not inherently evil, but chaotic and formidable. Alfheim and Svartalfheim housed elves and dwarves, beings of craftsmanship and hidden wisdom. Each realm reflected an aspect of the Norse understanding of existence: conflict, transformation, and the constant interplay between order and entropy. Archaeological evidence offers glimpses into how these beliefs were practiced. Excavations at sites like Uppsala in Sweden reveal great halls that served as both political and ritual centers. Wooden idols, now decayed, once stood in these sacred enclosures. Animal sacrifices, particularly horses, boars, and oxen, were part of major festivals, symbolizing renewal and alliance with divine powers. The blot, a sacrificial feast, was communal and pragmatic. Offerings ensured prosperity and fertility for the coming seasons. The Hof, or temple, was often no more than a chieftain's hall designated for ritual use, underscoring that religion and governance were inseparable. The Norse had no priestly caste in the institutional sense. The Gwa, often a local leader, oversaw rituals as both political and religious figure. Religion was thus embedded within local authority, and its practices varied widely between regions. In Iceland, archaeological remains suggest smaller, family-centered cult sites, while in Sweden, evidence points to grander ritual centers associated with royal power. This diversity reveals that Norse religion was not a single unified system, but a constellation of local traditions united by shared cosmology and myth. The myths themselves, preserved mainly through later sources like the Poetic Edda and Prose Edda, were not originally written doctrine, but oral stories shaped by centuries of retelling. They explain natural phenomena and moral dilemmas alike. The tale of Odin's self-sacrifice upon Yggdrasil, hanging for 9 nights to gain the runes, reflected the belief that wisdom required endurance. The story of Thor's struggle against the serpent Jormungandr illustrated the perpetual conflict between order and chaos. Ragnarok, the foreseen destruction and rebirth of the world, was not a prophecy of doom but a reflection of cyclical renewal, an acceptance that even gods must die so that creation might begin anew. Ritual objects found across Scandinavia further illuminate daily expressions of faith. Thor's hammer pendants were worn for protection, often appearing in both male and female burials. Amulets depicting ravens, wolves, and ships symbolized divine attributes or guardianship. The interlacing knot patterns of Norse art, later echoed in medieval manuscripts, may have carried spiritual significance, representing continuity and interconnection. Burial practices also reflected belief in the afterlife. Warriors were sometimes interred with weapons and ships, symbolizing the journey to the next world. Women of status were buried with jewelry, household tools, and occasionally animals, signs of continued life and duty beyond death. The ship burial at Oseberg in Norway, one of the most famous archaeological finds, provides profound insight into this worldview. 2 women of high rank were laid to rest within a richly furnished vessel containing textiles, carved animal head posts, and daily use objects. This burial, dating to around 834 CE, blurs the boundary between sacred and practical, suggesting that the ship itself was a vessel to the afterlife and a representation of social identity. The craftsmanship and ritual precision of such burials indicate a belief that the spiritual journey mirrored the physical one, a voyage across realms, guided by faith and memory. Magic and divination also played important roles in Norse belief. The practice of seer, often associated with the goddess Freya and later with Odin, involved prophecy, healing, and manipulation of fate. Women who performed these rites, called volar, held considerable social influence. They were seen as mediators between worlds, capable of communing with spirits and foretelling events. Archaeological evidence, such as staffs found in graves and references in sagas, confirms that such practices were respected yet feared. This intertwining of the mystical and the pragmatic characterized the Norse approach to the unknown, reverence tempered with caution. Religious transformation began in earnest during the late 10th and early 11th centuries. Contact with Christian Europe through trade, diplomacy, and conquest exposed Norse societies to new theological frameworks. Kings such as Harald Bluetooth in Denmark and Olaf Tryggvason in Norway adopted Christianity not only as faith, but as a political instrument, uniting diverse territories under a single ideology. Conversion was gradual and uneven. In some regions, old and new beliefs coexisted for generations. Crosses were carved alongside ruins. Churches were built on sites once dedicated to pagan gods. Rather than an abrupt replacement, the process was one of syncretism, a blending that allowed continuity even within transformation. Christianity introduced new moral concepts, but older values persisted. The emphasis on honor, kinship, and courage survived beneath the surface of the new faith. In many ways, the Norse ethos adapted rather than vanished. The sagas, written centuries later by Christian scribes, still celebrate pagan heroes and their codes of conduct, suggesting that memory of the old gods endured as cultural heritage even after belief had faded. This coexistence of past and present gave Norse identity its resilience. Today, archaeology continues to expand understanding of Norse spirituality. The excavation of ritual deposits, such as weapons thrown into bogs or offerings placed in lakes, reinforces that their religion was grounded in reciprocity, giving to the gods to maintain balance. DNA and isotope analyses of burials reveal that these practices extended far beyond Scandinavia, carried to Iceland, the British Isles, and even as far as Russia. The consistency of symbolic objects across vast distances underscores a shared mental world, a common Norse cosmology that transcended local variation. The endurance of Norse myth in modern culture, from literature to popular media, often romanticizes their gods as warriors or adventurers. Yet behind these modern reinterpretations lies a deeper truth. The original myths were frameworks for understanding existence in a volatile world. They articulated how people perceived life, death, and destiny. They offered meaning in a universe both awe-inspiring and indifferent. To study Norse belief is to glimpse the intellectual and emotional foundation of an entire civilization. By the close of the Viking Age, as churches replaced sacred groves and written scripture supplanted oral myth, the old gods retreated into memory. Yet their echoes persisted. In the days of the week named for Odin and Thor, in the symbols carved on stones, and in the cultural emphasis on resilience and courage. The Norse cosmos may have transformed, but its legacy remained inscribed in language, art, and imagination. This fusion of faith and identity shaped not only medieval Scandinavia, but the wider European world. It provided a bridge between the ancient and the modern, between mythic perception and historical consciousness. The transition from paganism to Christianity, from oral to written tradition, marked not an end but an evolution. Through this transformation, the spiritual heritage of the Vikings continued to guide their descendants into the new age of kingdoms, literacy, and nationhood. And as belief changed, so too did the worldview it sustained. The Norse understanding of fate and honor persisted, now reframed within Christian morality. Their gods became legends, their myths literature, and their rituals history. Yet beneath these layers of change, the essence of their worldview, the courage to face the inevitable with dignity, remained. In the next phase of this journey, attention turns from myth to material, the expansion of trade, technology, and cultural exchange that accompanied these spiritual transitions. The same people who once sought the favor of Thor and Odin would soon navigate not only seas but civilizations, leaving a legacy that would bind the Viking Age to the wider story of medieval Europe. The Viking Age was not only an era of raids and conquests, it was also one of the most dynamic periods of trade and exchange in early medieval history. Long before the Vikings appeared in the written records of Europe, the peoples of Scandinavia had already developed intricate systems of barter, craftsmanship, and maritime navigation. By the 9th century, these networks expanded dramatically, transforming the Norse from isolated northern farmers into key intermediaries of the medieval world economy. Their ships carried not just warriors but goods, ideas, and technologies that connected the north with the distant cultures of Byzantium, the Abbasid Caliphate, and beyond. The foundation of this network lay in geography. The Scandinavian peninsula, surrounded by seas and cut by fjords and rivers, compelled its inhabitants toward maritime adaptation. Limited arable land meant that agriculture could sustain families, but rarely produce significant surpluses. Timber, furs, amber, and iron became the region's principal commodities, exchanged for grain, silver, silk, and luxury goods from abroad. The sea was not a barrier, but a highway, and the Vikings became its most skilled navigators. Archaeological finds of trading settlements, such as Ribe in Denmark, Koppang in Norway, and Birka in Sweden, reveal that by the early 8th century, Scandinavia was already tied into the commercial circuits of northern Europe. At the heart of this expansion stood the longship. Lightweight, symmetrical, and shallow-drafted, it allowed for rapid travel across open seas and navigation along shallow rivers. Its versatility meant that a single vessel could traverse the North Sea, enter a river estuary, and reach deep inland without unloading cargo. This technological advantage provided the logistical foundation for both raiding and trade. Indeed, the distinction between the two was often fluid. The same crews who raided monasteries one season might return the next as merchants, exchanging furs, walrus ivory, and slaves for silver and manufactured goods. Among the earliest and most significant trading centers was Hedeby, located near the base of the Jutland Peninsula. Excavations reveal a dense urban settlement protected by an earthen rampart, with workshops, markets, and harbors capable of accommodating hundreds of ships. Artifacts from the site, Islamic dirhams, Frankish glassware, and Baltic amber, testify to the diversity of goods that flowed through it. Hedeby functioned as both a commercial hub and a diplomatic meeting point, where merchants from Scandinavia, the Carolingian Empire, and the Slavic lands met to exchange products and information. The discovery of coins from as far away as Samarkand and Baghdad indicates that Viking traders were part of a global system linking the northern forests to the Silk Road. The economic dynamism of the Viking world was sustained by the flow of silver. Beginning in the 9th century, vast quantities of Islamic silver coins, dirhams, entered Scandinavia through eastern trade routes. These coins, minted in the Abbasid Caliphate, traveled through the river systems of Russia via Norse merchants known as the Varangians. In sites such as Gotland and Uppland, archaeologists have uncovered hoards containing tens of thousands of dirhams, often cut into fragments for use as bullion. The weight of these finds illustrates not only the scale of trade, but also the degree to which silver became the monetary backbone of Viking commerce. Unlike centralized coinage systems elsewhere in Europe, Norse economies relied on weighed silver, a flexible standard that facilitated both small and large transactions. The eastern trade routes, often referred to as the Varangian routes, were among the most remarkable achievements of the Viking Age. From their settlements on the Baltic, Norse traders sailed across Lake Ladoga and down the great rivers of Eastern Europe, the Folkhof, Dnieper, and Volga, establishing fortified trading posts along the way. These routes connected the Baltic to the Black and Caspian Seas, opening access to Constantinople and the Islamic world. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Staraya Ladoga and Novgorod reveals Scandinavian weaponry, jewelry, and burial customs, confirming Norse presence deep within Slavic territories. By the mid-9th century, the Varangians had established control over key riverine trade corridors, and through interaction with local Slavic populations, they laid the foundations of what would become the early Rus state. The Primary Chronicle, a medieval East Slavic text, describes how Norse chieftains known as the Rurikids established political centers at Novgorod and Kiev. From these bases, they controlled the lucrative flow of goods between the Baltic and Byzantium. The Dnieper route led directly to the gates of Constantinople, known to the Vikings as Miklagar, the Great City. There, Norse merchants and warriors engaged in trade, and sometimes in mercenary service. The Varangian Guard, an elite unit of the Byzantine army composed largely of Norsemen, stands as a testament to these cross-cultural links. Western trade was equally significant. In the British Isles and along the coasts of Francia, Viking merchants established permanent markets and settlements that evolved into towns. Dublin, founded by Norse settlers around 841 CE, became one of the most important trading ports in the Western Viking world. It exported slaves, wool, and hides, and imported silver, wine, and fine textiles. Excavations in Dublin reveal a highly organized urban environment with streets, workshops, and docks. Similar developments occurred in York, where the Norse created a thriving commercial and administrative center known as Jorvik. The material culture of these towns, weights, scales, coins, and imported ceramics, reflects a sophisticated economy integrated with continental Europe. Trade extended beyond economic necessity. It also served as a conduit for cultural and technological exchange. Through contact with the Islamic world, Scandinavians encountered advanced metallurgical techniques, artistic motifs, and luxury materials such as silk. The adoption of coinage, though initially foreign, reshaped the Norse economy and social hierarchy. Silver wealth allowed chieftains to secure loyalty through gift-giving and to fund expeditions of exploration and colonization. The prestige associated with imported goods reinforced political power and social status. A chieftain's hall decorated with Byzantine glass or Abbasid silks was both a symbol of wealth and a statement of global connection. The slave trade formed another, more somber, component of Viking commerce. Raids and warfare across Europe produced captives who were sold in markets throughout the Viking world. Slaves, known as thralls, were vital to the labor economy, working in agriculture, construction, and domestic service. Many were transported through eastern routes to the markets of the Islamic world, where demand for European slaves was high. Although the practice was widespread across medieval societies, the Vikings' extensive maritime networks gave it a global scale. The wealth generated by this trade contributed to the prosperity of ports such as Hedeby, Dublin, and Kiev. Modern archaeology, through isotopic analysis of human remains, continues to uncover the human cost of this commerce, revealing diverse origins of individuals buried in Norse settlements. In the North Atlantic, trade accompanied colonization. The settlements in Iceland, Greenland, and briefly in North America were sustained by maritime exchange. Iceland exported wool, fish, and walrus ivory. Greenland provided furs, soapstone, and precious ivory from walrus tusks. In return, these colonies imported iron, timber, and grain from Norway. The precarious balance of these trade routes reveals the logistical challenges of sustaining communities at the edge of the known world. Yet they also demonstrate the adaptability of the Norse maritime system. Even at such distances, a common cultural and economic identity persisted, linking the scattered settlements of the North Atlantic to the heartlands of Scandinavia. As the Viking Age progressed, economic patterns evolved. The shift from plunder to commerce marked a broader transformation in Norse society. Early raids had targeted portable wealth, but as settlements took root, long-term trade relationships proved more profitable. Market towns multiplied, and craft specialization increased. Archaeological evidence from sites like Birka shows workshops producing glass beads, iron tools, and bronze jewelry for export. Weighing scales and standardized weights, often made of lead or bronze, reflect a growing sophistication in commercial exchange. These developments indicate an economy that was no longer purely redistributive but increasingly market-oriented. Coinage played a crucial role in this transition. Initially, foreign silver circulated as bullion, but by the late 10th century, Scandinavian rulers began minting their own coins. Kings such as Harald Bluetooth and Olaf Tryggvason issued coinage modeled on Anglo-Saxon and German prototypes. These coins were not merely economic tools, but political instruments, asserting sovereignty and legitimacy. The inscriptions and symbols on these coins reveal the intertwining of commerce, governance, and ideology. The emergence of royal mints signaled the integration of Viking polities into the monetary and administrative systems of medieval Europe. Cultural influences flowed in both directions. Norse art and ornamentation, characterized by intricate animal motifs and interlacing patterns, spread across Europe through trade goods and settlers. At the same time, Scandinavian craftsmen adopted techniques from abroad, incorporating Christian symbols, Islamic calligraphy, and continental metalwork into their designs. This aesthetic fusion reflects the cosmopolitanism of the Viking world. It was a civilization simultaneously peripheral and connected, geographically remote, yet economically central to the early medieval global exchange network. The decline of the Viking trading system in the 11th century coincided with broader transformations in European and Eurasian commerce. The rise of centralized monarchies, the spread of Christianity, and the development of new trade routes under emerging states gradually diminished the autonomy of Viking merchants. Many of the great emporia, such as Birka and Hedeby, were abandoned as political boundaries hardened and royal control increased. Yet the legacy of these markets endured. They had laid the groundwork for urbanization in Northern Europe and for the integration of the Scandinavian economies into the continental system. Modern archaeological and numismatic research continues to refine understanding of this commercial world. Excavations of shipwrecks along the Baltic and North Sea coasts reveal cargoes of raw materials and finished goods, offering tangible evidence of the vast maritime economy. Hoards of silver, once buried for safekeeping, provide data on the volume and reach of Viking trade. Scientific analysis of isotopes and trace elements allows researchers to trace the origins of metals and goods, mapping a network that extended from the North Atlantic to Central Asia. The story of Viking trade is ultimately one of transformation. It began with isolated farmers exchanging furs and iron within local markets and culminated in a maritime economy that linked continents. Through commerce, the Norse expanded not only their wealth but their worldview. They became intermediaries between cultures, translators of technology, and conduits of knowledge. Their ships carried stories, languages, and ideas as readily as they carried silver and silk. This economic expansion also reshaped their social structure. Merchants emerged as a distinct and influential class, bridging the worlds of warrior and farmer. The accumulation of wealth through trade allowed for new forms of patronage and power, laying the economic foundation for the rise of medieval Scandinavian kingdoms. The transformation from raider to ruler was inseparable from the mastery of commerce. By the end of the Viking Age, the trade routes forged by Norse sailors had become arteries of a new European order. The North was no longer isolated. The once peripheral lands of Scandinavia now stood as integral participants in a connected world stretching from the Atlantic to the Caspian Sea. The story of this transformation does not end with commerce. It continues in the evolution of governance, law, and identity, the ways in which economic power translated into political authority. The next stage of the Viking journey reveals how their expanding networks and newfound wealth laid the groundwork for centralized rule, written law, and the emergence of the Scandinavian kingdoms that would carry their legacy into the Middle Ages. By the close of the 10th century, the Viking world was changing. The era of raiding and exploration that had once defined Scandinavian identity was giving way to a more settled and structured order. Trade, urbanization, and conversion had already reshaped the social fabric of the North, and from these developments emerged a new phenomenon: centralized rule. The loose networks of chieftains and local assemblies began to coalesce into recognizable kingdoms. The process was gradual and uneven, differing across Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, but its outcome was transformative. Within 2 centuries, the lands that had once launched raiders toward every corner of Europe would stand as stable monarchies, governed by law and united by emerging national identities. The foundations of governance in the Viking world predated kingship. Authority had long rested on kinship, reputation, and consensus rather than coercion. The basic political unit was the bygd, or district community, composed of families bound by mutual obligation. Within each district, the thing served as the governing assembly. It was both a legislative and judicial institution, open to free men who could speak, vote, and deliberate on matters of law and dispute. The thing represented a deeply ingrained tradition of participatory governance, a system that emphasized balance rather than hierarchy. Power was negotiated, not imposed. The legal culture that emerged from the thing was oral and communal. Law speakers, known as lögskummer in Icelandic tradition, held the role of memorizing and reciting the law. Their authority lay in knowledge and memory rather than enforcement. This system produced a distinctive form of social order. Justice was achieved through compensation rather than punishment. The principle of wergild, or manprice, assigned a value to life and injury, allowing conflicts to be resolved through payment rather than vengeance. Such laws maintained equilibrium in societies without standing armies or police. As trade and wealth expanded, however, so did the complexity of governance. The rise of fortified towns and permanent settlements created new administrative challenges. Chieftains who could command ships and followers now sought to control markets, collect taxes, and regulate commerce. Authority became territorial. The first Scandinavian rulers who began to call themselves kings did so not as conquerors in the Roman sense, but as unifiers of people and law. Their legitimacy depended on negotiation with local assemblies, alliances with powerful families, and often, the endorsement of the church. In Denmark, the consolidation of royal power began earliest. Archaeological and written sources alike identify the 9th century ruler Gorm the Old and his son Harald Bluetooth as key architects of Danish unification. Harald's famous runestone at Jelling, inscribed with the declaration that he made the Danes Christian and united Denmark, stands as both monument and manifesto. The Jelling complex, with its monumental mounds, church, and runestones, embodies the fusion of pagan and Christian, traditional and royal authority. It was a symbolic center for a new kind of governance, divine sanction coupled with territorial control. Norway's path to kingship was more fragmented. Its geography of deep fjords and mountain valleys fostered regional independence. Local chieftains wielded considerable power, and early kings struggled to impose unity. According to later sagas, Harald Fairhair is credited with unifying Norway around 872 CE after the Battle of Hafrsfjord, though the historicity of this event remains debated. What is clear is that the process of unification took generations. Kings such as Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson, later Saint Olaf, continued the work, combining force with diplomacy and religious conversion. The establishment of Christianity provided ideological cohesion, giving monarchs the divine legitimacy to extend authority beyond kinship lines. Sweden's political evolution followed a distinct path. The region was divided between the agricultural heartlands of Uppland and the trading centers of the East. Kingship there remained elective for longer, and power was often shared between royal and noble factions. The cultic center at Uppsala, with its temple complex and ritual functions, anchored early Swedish kingship and religious tradition. Over time, the integration of trade networks and Christian institutions fostered stronger central rule, culminating in the medieval kingdom that would emerge by the 12th century. Throughout Scandinavia, the interplay between old traditions and new institutions defined political development. The thing did not disappear with kingship. Instead, it was integrated into royal administration. Kings required the consent of assemblies to levy taxes, raise armies, and codify laws. This balance between monarchic and communal authority produced a distinctive Scandinavian constitutional tradition, one that valued consensus and local autonomy even within emerging states. The Icelandic Althing, established around 930 CE, remains one of the oldest continuous parliamentary institutions in the world, a testament to the endurance of early Norse legal culture. Law itself evolved from oral to written form during this period. The introduction of Christianity and Latin literacy facilitated codification. The earliest known Scandinavian law codes, such as the Gulathing and Frostathing laws in Norway and the Jutland law in Denmark, date from the 12th and 13th centuries but preserve earlier practices. These texts reveal societies transitioning from feud-based justice to centralized adjudication. They address issues ranging from inheritance and marriage to property rights and homicide, illustrating a complex and pragmatic legal consciousness. The Christian Church played a central role in this transformation. Conversion had introduced not only new beliefs, but new bureaucratic and educational frameworks. Monasteries and bishoprics became centers of record-keeping, diplomacy, and governance. Bishops often acted as royal advisors, and the Church's emphasis on written law and moral authority reinforced kingship. Cathedrals and churches, rising across Scandinavia in stone and timber, stood as symbols of a new social order, one that combined faith, law, and political unity. Economically, the rise of kingship was inseparable from taxation and trade control. As markets grew, rulers sought to regulate coinage, weights, and measures. Royal mints, already established under Harold Bluetooth and his successors, provided revenue and a means of projecting authority. The circulation of coins bearing royal names and crosses reinforced both political identity and Christian allegiance. Control of harbors and trading towns allowed kings to collect tolls, transforming maritime commerce into an instrument of governance. Yet royal power remained fragile. Scandinavian kings ruled more through negotiation than decree. Their authority depended on maintaining networks of loyalty among nobles and warriors. Gift exchange and feasting continued as mechanisms of alliance building. The King's Hall remained both a political and social center, where disputes were settled and relationships renewed. Archaeological remains of royal sites such as Lidra, Tiso, and Avaldens reveal these spaces as nodes of governance, combining ritual, diplomacy, and economic management. By the 11th century, the consolidation of royal authority was evident in the emergence of national symbols and dynastic continuity. Denmark, under Knut the Great, briefly formed a North Sea empire encompassing England, Norway, and parts of Sweden. Knut's reign, 1016 to 1035, exemplified the integration of Viking and European political traditions. He ruled through a combination of military strength, legal codification, and ecclesiastical patronage. His charters in England and coinage across his dominions demonstrate administrative sophistication and participation in the wider Christian world. Knut's empire, however, was short-lived. After his death, regional loyalties reasserted themselves, and the Scandinavian kingdoms reverted to independent development. Yet his legacy endured in the model of kingship he represented: Christian, literate, and law-giving. The age of sea kings gave way to the age of territorial monarchs. From this foundation emerged the medieval states that would define Northern Europe for centuries. The growing prominence of law and governance also reflected a cultural shift toward order and stability. The old ethos of vengeance and honor gradually yielded to institutional justice. The transformation can be traced in the sagas, where heroes increasingly appeal to law rather than violence to resolve conflicts. Legal assemblies became arenas for negotiation and rhetoric. Disputes over land, inheritance, and reputation were debated before the community, and verdicts carried moral as well as practical weight. In this way, law became not only an instrument of governance, but a reflection of collective identity. The relationship between ruler and ruled remained dynamic. Kings who ignored traditional rights or failed to respect the autonomy of local assemblies faced rebellion. The concept of the king as lawgiver rather than lawmaker persisted. He was seen as the guardian of ancestral custom, not its creator. This idea, deeply rooted in Norse tradition, tempered the absolutism that characterized other medieval monarchies. It preserved a measure of communal participation that would shape Scandinavian political culture into the modern era. Archaeological discoveries continue to illuminate this transformation. Excavations at royal centers reveal administrative infrastructure, storage pits, workshops, and imported goods, indicating sustained economic management. Written sources, such as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Continental Annals, complement this evidence, documenting the growing diplomatic engagement of Scandinavian rulers with the rest of Europe. By the late 11th century, kings from the north were recognized as peers among European monarchs, their courts tied by marriage and alliance to those of England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire. This integration also fostered cultural standardization. The adoption of Latin script replaced runic writing in most formal contexts, enabling correspondence and record-keeping. Legal codes were written down, genealogies were preserved, and chronicles began to frame the history of the North as part of Christendom. These developments mark the culmination of a process that had begun centuries earlier, when Norse sailors first ventured beyond their fjords. The unification of law and governance completed the transformation from a world of kinship networks to that of centralized states. The rise of the Scandinavian kingdoms thus represents one of the most remarkable political evolutions in medieval history. From decentralized assemblies to organized monarchies, from oral law to written code, from raiding fleets to royal navies. Each stage reflects adaptation to new realities. The forces that once propelled the Vikings across oceans now turned inward, building institutions capable of enduring peace. By the 12th century, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden stood as Christian monarchies with defined borders, codified laws, and diplomatic relations across Europe. Yet beneath this new order, the echoes of the old remained. The traditions of the thing, the emphasis on community consensus, and the moral weight of honor continued to inform governance. The Viking spirit, resourceful, pragmatic, and self-reliant, persisted in the legal and political culture of the North. This transformation did not mark an end but a beginning, the transition from the Viking Age to the medieval Scandinavian world. The same qualities that had enabled exploration and trade now sustained administration and law. Through this evolution, the Norse peoples completed their journey from warriors of the sea to builders of nations, carrying forward a legacy of adaptability that would define Northern Europe for centuries to come. In the next and final stage of this historical journey, attention turns to the enduring impact of the Viking world, how its memory, myths, and achievements shaped the later medieval imagination, and how the legacy of these northern peoples continues to inform modern identity and historical understanding. The Viking Age formally ended nearly a millennium ago, yet its echoes continue to resonate through history, culture, and imagination. From the medieval chronicles that first recorded their deeds to the global fascination of the modern era, the Norse legacy has endured with extraordinary vitality. This endurance is not the survival of myth alone, but the continuation of influence in law, language, seafaring, governance, and the very conception of identity across Northern Europe. The end of Viking expansion marked not disappearance, but transformation. The people who once launched ships into unknown seas became the architects of stable societies, whose cultural memory preserved the values and achievements of their ancestors in evolving forms. In the immediate aftermath of the Viking Age, the memory of the Norse was shaped by the written cultures that surrounded them. Christian chroniclers in England, Francia, and the Holy Roman Empire recorded the Viking incursions with a mixture of fear and fascination. To them, the Northmen were both scourge and marvel, pagans who disrupted Christendom but also participants in divine history. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and the writings of chroniclers such as Alcuin of York and Adam of Bremen portrayed the Vikings through a moral lens, interpreting raids as divine punishment or tests of faith. These narratives preserved valuable historical data, but they also defined an enduring image, the Viking as both outsider and catalyst in the making of medieval Europe. Within Scandinavia itself, the 12th and 13th centuries witnessed the emergence of written histories that reframed the Viking past from within. The Icelandic sagas, composed in Old Norse prose, transformed oral tradition into literary heritage. Works such as Heimskringla, attributed to Snorri Sturluson, compiled the deeds of kings and chieftains into a coherent national chronicle. Saga authors combined genealogical memory, folklore, and moral reflection, preserving a vision of a heroic but humanized past. Their portrayal of honor, fate, and law captured the complexity of Norse society, its realism, pragmatism, and sense of destiny, and offered one of the earliest examples of historical consciousness in vernacular literature. The sagas also ensured that the Viking legacy would not fade into obscurity. Their language, imagery, and themes became cultural touchstones for later generations. When Scandinavian monarchies consolidated into Christian states, they turned to these texts to assert legitimacy and continuity. Kings traced descent from legendary ancestors. Poets and clerics invoked the valor and endurance of the early Norse to define the moral character of their peoples. In this way, the Viking Age became a foundational myth for national identity, not as an era of lawlessness, but as a period of formation and discovery. Archaeological discoveries reinforced this cultural memory. From the 12th century onward, burial mounds, runestones, and ship remains continued to mark the Scandinavian landscape. Even as Christianity reshaped religious life, the presence of these ancient monuments served as reminders of ancestral achievement. The stones of Jelling, with their inscriptions bridging pagan and Christian iconography, remained visible symbols of continuity. In Iceland, the The sites of the Althing and early farmsteads linked the written sagas to tangible geography. Each generation interpreted these remains anew, integrating them into evolving understandings of the past. During the later Middle Ages, the Norse legacy also found expression beyond Scandinavia. The descendants of Viking settlers in the British Isles, Normandy, and Ireland became integral to the formation of European political systems. The Duchy of Normandy, established by Rollo and his successors, produced William the Conqueror, whose invasion of England in 1066 would permanently alter European history. The Norman synthesis of Scandinavian vigor and Frankish administration gave rise to one of the most powerful dynasties of the medieval world. In the British Isles, Norse place names, laws, and cultural patterns endured, particularly in regions such as the Danelaw and the Scottish Isles. Linguistic evidence, words like law, husband, and sky, still bears witness to the depth of this integration. The long-term influence of Norse exploration extended even farther. The Greenland and Vinland voyages marked the first European contact with North America centuries before Columbus. Although these settlements did not endure, their rediscovery in the modern era reshaped our understanding of global exploration. Archaeological work at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland confirmed saga accounts of transatlantic voyages, offering a striking example of how oral memory preserved historical truth across centuries. The Norse thus occupy a unique place in human history, as both ancient and modern discoverers, bridging worlds long before the age of discovery began. In the modern period, the legacy of the Vikings was rediscovered and reinterpreted through new lenses. The Romantic movement of the 19th century revived interest in the medieval North as a source of national pride and artistic inspiration. Scholars, poets, and painters sought to reclaim the sagas and mythology as expressions of the northern spirit, noble, untamed, and authentic. In Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Iceland, this cultural awakening coincided with struggles for independence and identity. The Vikings became symbols of resilience and self-determination, embodying the values of freedom and endurance against external domination. At the same time, archaeology emerged as a scientific discipline, providing new material evidence to balance literary tradition. Excavations at Oseberg, Gokstad, and Birka revealed the sophistication of Norse craftsmanship, trade, and ritual life. The Oseberg ship burial, discovered in 1904, astonished the world with its artistry and preservation. The grave goods, carved sledges, textiles, tools, and even food offerings, painted a vivid picture of elite life in the 9th century. The combination of archaeology and philology transformed Viking studies from legend into science, allowing historians to reconstruct the social and economic realities behind the myths. The 20th century brought further layers of reinterpretation. As Europe endured wars and upheaval, the image of the Viking fluctuated between hero and symbol. Nationalists and propagandists sometimes appropriated Norse imagery for ideological ends, distorting its meaning. Yet scholarly research continued to refine understanding, emphasizing the diversity and adaptability of Viking culture rather than militarism alone. By the later 20th century, a new consensus emerged. The Viking Age was not a story of conquest, but of connection, an era in which northern peoples integrated into the wider networks of medieval Eurasia through trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. This reinterpretation aligned with broader global perspectives. The Vikings came to be seen not merely as raiders, but as agents of cultural transmission. Their settlements from the North Atlantic to the Black Sea facilitated the movement of goods, technologies, and ideas. The Norse contributed to the shaping of medieval Europe's economic geography, linking east and west through river routes and maritime trade. Their legacy lies as much in the cities they helped found, Dublin, York, Kiev, as in the myths they inspired. Modern archaeology and genetics continue to reveal the extent of this integration, showing that the Viking world was not isolated but deeply interconnected with the civilizations it encountered. Popular culture has played a central role in sustaining this legacy. From 19th century operas to 21st century television, the Vikings have remained fixtures of imagination. The helmets, ships, and symbols associated with them have entered global iconography, often simplified but enduringly recognizable. While popular portrayals frequently emphasize adventure and warfare, they also reflect fascination with resilience, freedom, and exploration. The modern revival of Norse mythology in literature, music, and film reflects humanity's continued search for meaning in ancient narratives. The gods of Asgard and the sagas of human courage resonate as metaphors for timeless struggles, survival, fate, and the search for belonging. Beyond myth, the real achievements of the Viking world continue to influence modern society. The Scandinavian legal traditions that valued consensus and local autonomy foreshadowed modern democratic practices. The spirit of exploration that carried Norse sailors across oceans reappears in the maritime innovation and global engagement that define the Nordic nations today. The emphasis on equality, community, and practical governance that characterized Viking society remains visible in the political cultures of the modern North. Even linguistic and genetic traces connect contemporary populations to their Viking ancestors, reminding us that history is not distant but continuous. Archaeological work in the 21st century continues to refine the picture. Advances in DNA analysis have revealed the diversity of Viking populations, confirming that their ranks included not only men from Scandinavia, but women and individuals from distant lands. These findings challenge long-held assumptions and highlight the cosmopolitan nature of Viking society. New excavations in England, Denmark, and the Baltic uncover evidence of urban planning, craft production, and social mobility, underscoring the complexity of their world. Each discovery adds nuance to the narrative, replacing the image of the marauder with that of the merchant, settler, and innovator. The endurance of the Viking legacy also lies in its adaptability. Every era has reinterpreted it according to its own values and questions. For medieval chroniclers, the Vikings were instruments of divine purpose. For romantic nationalists, they embodied freedom and destiny. For modern scholars, they represent connection and transformation. The power of the Viking story lies in this capacity to evolve, to remain meaningful across changing contexts. It is a reminder that history is not fixed but continuously rewritten through evidence, reflection, and imagination. Today, museums and heritage sites across Scandinavia and beyond preserve this legacy with renewed attention to authenticity and inclusivity. The Viking Ship Museum in Oslo, the National Museum in Copenhagen, and the archaeological parks at Birka and Lofoten present the past not as spectacle, but as living history. Exhibits emphasize craftsmanship, trade, and daily life, countering stereotypes and revealing the humanity of the Norse world. Educational programs and digital reconstructions invite new generations to explore how a society once defined by mobility and adaptability helped shape the foundations of the modern world. The endurance of Norse influence is also linguistic and conceptual. Words derived from Old Norse persist in modern English and Scandinavian languages, carrying fragments of ancient worldviews. Concepts such as law, thing, and fellowship reflect values of collective governance and mutual responsibility. These linguistic survivals are not mere curiosities. They are evidence of how cultural contact reshaped language and thought across Europe. The vocabulary of justice, exploration, and community still bears the imprint of the Viking Age. In historical perspective, the Viking legacy demonstrates the resilience of culture through transformation. The same adaptability that allowed Norse societies to thrive in harsh environments and distant lands enabled their descendants to integrate into changing worlds without losing their identity. The shift from paganism to Christianity, from raiding to governance, and from oral tradition to written law represents not discontinuity, but evolution. The Norse experience illustrates how societies can absorb external influences while preserving core values, a lesson that continues to resonate in a globalized world. The story of the Viking Age is therefore more than a chronicle of the past. It is a study in continuity. From the ship burials of Oseberg to the digital archives of modern scholarship, from the carved runestones of Jelling to the modern capitals of Scandinavia, the line of cultural inheritance remains unbroken. The world the Vikings helped shape, through exploration, trade, and governance, laid part of the groundwork for the interconnected societies of today. Through archaeology and written record, their story continues to teach us how civilization evolves. The Vikings remind us that identity is not born in isolation, but forged through movement, contact, and adaptation. The end of their age was not a vanishing, but a transformation, the beginning of a long continuum that still informs the northern imagination and, through it, the shared heritage of humanity.